Good morning. Welcome to the 23rd meeting of the committee in 2013. Can I ask everyone to ensure that all mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off, please? Before we move on to the main business of the meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that this is the last meeting of the committee for our colleague Margaret Mitchell before she moves on to a new role in the Justice Committee, and I'm sure that we all hope that you enjoy that. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for all of your efforts. Your input has been appreciated by most of the time. I realise that you take the job of scrutiny to heart and are very assiduous in it. I think you're going to be a real loss to this committee, but all the best, Margaret, in your new role. Agenda item 1 is delivery of Regeneration in Scotland. The first item is to take evidence on that issue. We will have 3 panels of witnesses before us today representing local authorities and enterprise agencies. The witnesses before us today have made written submissions which members have in papers. Can I welcome the first panel? Councillor Mary Evans, convener of the Infrastructure Committee at Angus Council, and joined by Mr Alan McEwen, Strategic Director for Communities at Angus. Councillor Chris Thompson, Chair of the Enterprise Services Committee of South Lanarkshire Council, along with Jim McCaffrey, Head of Regeneration Services at the same authority. And Councillor Lawrence O'Neill, Vice Convener of the Housing, Environment and Economic Development Committee of Western Bartonshire Council, and he's accompanied by Jim McAloon, Head of Regeneration and Economic Development at Western Bartonshire Council. Can I welcome you all? I would ask if anyone has any brief opening statements to make. No opening statements. Councillor O'Neill.
Can I just apologise on behalf of Western Bartonshire that our convener is unfortunately unable to attend today because we have another committee on this afternoon which will have a positive regeneration outcome within Western Bartonshire, hopefully.
Very good indeed. You're welcome, Councillor O'Neill. If I could ask the first question, please. I wonder if you could give us an idea of the size of funding for specific regeneration activity. And beyond that, if you could give us an indication of the proportion of that monies that is used for community organisations and community-led regeneration. We want to start with Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chair. Within Western Bartonshire over the last year or so, as we were setting the budget, we have now embarked on a 10-year capital regeneration investment, somewhere in the region of £133 million. We're building some new care homes, some new schools. We're investing £85 million in housing to meet the Scottish housing quality standards. So there's been quite a turnaround in terms of Western Bartonshire. Under a previous administration, we were potentially going for a partial stock transfer, but under a new administration in May 2012, we changed that course. So the officers have now come round to that and will be delivering a full Scottish housing quality standard of £85 million on our 10,000 or so houses. We have embarked on building 2 new care homes for provision of I think 90 beds between each of them. And we are taking on board suggestions from particularly within the community about how we can take forward the suggestions, and we've done a lot of work round about the budgeting and certainly in terms of the capital programme, saying what communities would like to hear and what they would like to see. So we will involve them through the process of that. So we've got a lot of money that's been put aside, you know, and it worries me a lot of time in terms of the budgets, but we have many challenges within Western Bartonshire in terms of within Clydebank as an old industrial town, you know, in terms of how we make ourselves attractive within Western Bartonshire to regeneration and how we can provide an infrastructure that helps regeneration come on within our particular communities. We're faced with massive challenges, as most authorities are, in terms of unemployment, and particularly in terms of youth unemployment within Western Bartonshire, and we've set aside £2.83 million to look at, particularly within the council's own resources, and working alongside DWP and Skills Development Scotland to try and look at how we can bring in. We set an ambition of 1,000 jobs and 1,000 days in administration, and we are way ahead of what we'd hoped to achieve. We're at 67% of our target just now. So many challenges are faced, but we have put in a huge amount of money, and certainly as one of the council taxpayers of Western Bartonshire, it doesn't quite give me sleepless nights. However, we're heading in the right direction.
Feel free to bring in Mr. McAloon, but what is that huge amount of money that's been allocated to regeneration? And again, I would reiterate the point that I would really like to know how much of that, what proportion of that is going into community projects and community-led regeneration.
In terms of an actual figure, Chair, I would be happy to provide the committee with the overall sum, but to endorse what Councillor O'Neill has said, is the council, through community planning partnership, have listened to the community, and some of the examples that we've recently set up is we've actually ring-fenced, for example, a sum of money for a social enterprise challenge, and that's an opportunity to try and encourage local communities to set up some enterprises to support themselves. And this year we're looking to support 3 social enterprise organisations. There are 9 applicants, and they're being assessed later on this week. If they're successful, each start-up enterprise would be supported by £15,000 in their first year, plus Business Gateway support and other support through, as Councillor O'Neill mentioned, the money that we've set aside, which is additional to Scottish Enterprise and Skills Development Scotland for employing people, £2.83 million, which was supplemented by a further £300,000 from the council. Councillor O'Neill mentioned that we're at 66% of this 1,000 jobs in 1,000 days. The council has made a fantastic effort on its own in that we've taken on over 175 modern apprenticeships this year alone, with 100% of those youngsters gaining jobs at the end of it through the council.
Thank you. The committee would be really interested in getting the detail round about the specific budgets and that proportion. If that could be sent, that would be very useful. Councillor Thompson, from your council's perspective, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. The figures are for regeneration, as you asked, is £9 million. However, that has got to be looked at in the wider context. We see regeneration as an intricate part of the work that we do. So the decisions that we're making on housing, on schools, in purchasing through the council and through employability, these are all linked. We see this working together with ourselves and our partners through the Community Planning Partnership. We not only have regeneration areas in the built-up areas, but we also have it in the rural areas as well. Some of these issues that we're facing, I'm sure like our colleagues here, are very, very testing indeed. We were seeing some significant progress up to 2009 and 10. However, the changes that are being made by the UK government, I think we're going to see that slip back a bit, unfortunately. There's a mismatch in policies between the UK government and what some of the rest of us are trying to do. These mismatches include the work programme, which is, to be frank with you, no use in a regeneration area. And of course, there are changes to benefits, which again affects these areas very, very dramatically. I'm going to ask Jim, if you don't mind, Chair, to come in a few minutes to give you actual detail on this. I mentioned Clyde Gateway earlier, which is the Urban Regeneration Company, which I'm also a founder member of. Again, we're working with that organisation in what is one of the most deprived areas of South Lanarkshire and Glasgow, highly contaminated land, and some of the worst figures in the country of long-term unemployment, poor education standards, etc., the sort of things that we see. We in South Lanarkshire have been working on this for a very long time. We've had a regeneration strategy going back for a very, very long time. We have a poverty strategy, which again goes back a considerable amount of time. One thing I would say to committee is there's no quick fixes for this. If we want to regenerate these areas, and I think we all do, we have to be in it for the long term. That means consistent investment over a 20 to 25-year period. It's about changing the economic situation for many of the people that live in that area. It's not just about putting up buildings, decontaminating land. It's about changing lives. It's about getting people back to work. It's about getting them economically active. It's about improving their health, about improving their education, and about improving their ambitions. Now, that's a big, big ask to make. But if we continue to invest in it, I think in years to come, I won't be sitting around this table, I'm sure, but those who will be sitting around these tables will see that that investment is very, very worthwhile. It's regeneration, as I said, is a central part of the policy of the Council. It is supported by all the political parties within the Council and by the independents as well. We have the same view that we need to tackle the worst areas, we need to invest in it over a long period of time, we need to measure how we're getting on, and we need to work with government and other agencies to make sure that that money goes to where it's most needed. Chair, with your permission, I'll ask Jim to come in if that's okay.
Sure. Mr McCaffrey.
Yes, very quickly, Chair. Councillor Thompson's mentioned the £9 million of support the Council gives to regeneration activity in South Lanarkshire. As other authorities will testify, that money is then used to lever in money from Europe, from the Scottish Government itself, lottery and other sources. So just very briefly, we spend around £9 million per annum on employability programmes. My colleagues mentioned the outcomes in relation to Western Bartonshire. We try and support around 5,000 people per year through those programmes. We spend around £1 million in business support programmes. Councillor Thompson mentioned poverty. We have a specific tackling poverty fund of around £5 million that helps health improvement programmes, family support programmes, employability programmes. In terms of leader programme, we have a programme of around £500,000 a year that we spend in our rural area. And we support the Clegg Gateway Initiative directly with funds of just under £1 million per annum. In terms of capital funds, we spend around £5 million per annum on capital works. Thank you, Chair.
In terms of proportion spent on community-led, do you have that at your fingertips?
At our fingertips, I would say that the LEADER programme, clearly the Rural Development Programme, is very much a bottom-up grassroots initiative. So all of those resources and the bulk of the tackling poverty funds, working with local communities. Again, I would suggest that all of that budget, the £5 million, is very much linked closely to community needs.
If we could get further detail on that, that would be extremely useful for the committee during the course of its deliberations. Yeah, can I come back? Very briefly, Councillor Thompson.
Add to what Jim had said, we have a Community Planning Partnership Board, which the community sits on with our partners. The decisions that are made and recommended to the Community Planning Partnership are we fully involve the community. We've recently started new initiatives in the 5% worst areas of actually making sure that we're building the capacity of those communities to be able to make that contribution. The difficulty for us is in many of these areas, because of that situation, that if you are looking for volunteers, if you are looking for people to get involved, it can be very, very difficult for them to do it. So we are spending a lot of time in a number of these areas with our partners, building that capacity so that people can make that level of contribution, can be involved in those decisions and make a real difference to what we're doing. That piece of work is ongoing, and I'm sure Jim will be glad to supply that to you as well.
Thank you. Councillor Evans, please.
Thank you. Well, to be honest, I find it quite hard to quantify, really. I think we probably have a similar capital spend to other authorities of a similar size. But I think when you're looking at regeneration and the whole social aspect of that as well, it is hard to put a figure on how much we spend in that area, because obviously the money is divided into various different projects between social work and education, especially when we look at early years intervention and all that kind of work, if we're looking at regeneration in its broadest context. I mean, and we do a lot of our work through the community planning partnerships. And we do have a community grant scheme, which is to help community groups and various activities they want to hold. That has a budget probably about around 160,000. But I suppose that when we work with community groups, particularly well in the area that I'm from, Brechin, we have a very strong group there just now. There's a lot of community planning and a lot of community activity going on, but rather than looking for money from the council or us allocating a budget towards helping them do that, it's actually trying to help them access monies elsewhere, if you see what I mean, through all the different activities that they're trying to do. And through that, they're actually trying to plan for Brechin's future, what it's going to look like 10, 20 years down the line. And we're just helping to facilitate that and provide support through community planning. So as I say, I find the economic and social regeneration aspect of it a little harder to quantify in terms of hard figures, if that's what you're looking for.
Mr McEwan, do you want to add anything to that?
I think what we'll do is we'll pull together the kind of figures in the same way that colleagues have indicated they will, and break down on the kind of various aspects in which they come, including our capital spend from various big projects. But as Councillor Evans highlights, the Council has shifted itself away from a budget-led approach to an outcomes-led approach, and trying to use money flexibly and see the added value and see connections with, for example, building new schools, or working with our colleagues in NHS around hubs through community planning to see how do we tie that into sustainable economic regeneration, jobs during the building process, and jobs and sustainable employment during the lifetime of those projects. And of course, getting into some of those things means getting out of some of our other estate, and it's those things we're wrestling with. And one of the key things that we're wrestling with right now is community asset transfer and valuing assets against some of the rules around what best value the council has to achieve for general fund assets, with what communities feel that they can afford to pay and what they want to do with those. So it's really a positive shift from a budget-led approach to an outcomes-led approach.
What you're describing there to me is ensuring that mainstream budgets are used to help in regeneration. Would that be correct? Am I right in assuming
yes,
that that's what you're trying to say? And with the same go yes or no answers for the other authorities as well? Bending the spend to get the most out of it. We'll probably return to that aspect in a little while. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to focus on capital spend in the questions I want to try and address to you all. First contribution today was from Councillor O'Neill, who gave us a very impressive list of projects. If you had no regeneration department of the council and no regeneration project, which of those projects would not proceed?
I don't know if at this point we should defer to the officer.
Mr McAloon.
That's a very difficult question, particularly for an officer to answer.
Will I attempt to assist you by...
It, Mr McAloon.
No, it's not a political question.
I know, but officers are always wary of these ones.
No.
You should maybe ask what priorities would still stand.
No, it's not that at all, Convener, if I may. I really, I'm hearing a list of projects. If you had no regeneration, I think you'd do every one of these projects anyway. Because you still need new schools, you still need new accommodation for the elderly, etc. I want to try and tease out from your capital spending what is only happening because you're doing regeneration. And I'm starting from a position of not being clear. I mean, on the revenue, I think it's easier, but on capital, I'm not clear. So I'm going to go around the table if the convener permits.
Do you want to try again, Mr McAloon?
I think one of the projects that has been absolutely driven from we need to try and make a difference in a local area and it links to the review on town centres that's just been completed, and about looking at town centres have to be much more than the retail experience, and have to be attractive and a centre that the community want to use. And one of our key projects is in actual fact a new civic building. And what we've done working through Scottish Futures Trust is working with all the public agencies in terms of their asset strategies and whatever. And we're still part of the way through that, but already we've identified that there is a partnership in terms of need from the police in terms of a presence. And what we've also done is we've done an economic impact on the council staff spend in an area, and it all points to the one town would benefit greatest, and that town's Dumbarton. And so one of the key drivers for the council could put a new civic headquarters anywhere, but what we're trying to do is to link it to the regeneration needs of that town. But we're also linking it with a new secondary school in relation to Our Lady in St Pat's, which is another of the regeneration projects. But one of the things that we are looking at is the location of that school. If a walkway bridge was put in place, the flow of traffic into that town centre would multiply tenfold per day. And so, as an example, I think driven by the regeneration, the absolute regeneration requirement of that town, a couple of those projects are being driven to increase the footfall and increase the need for the community to come in. That will then uplift, our belief is that will then uplift the existing retail that is there and new retail to come in.
Stuart?
So what really I'm hearing you say, and you can agree or disagree, is that you're using the needs in communities to prioritise the spending you might normally make in any event, for quite proper policy reasons, to areas where the regeneration impact will be greatest. Now, of course, you'll not always achieve that. So that's essential. Right, I'm getting nodding heads. Let's just move on, perhaps, to Councillor Thompson and his team, where you said regeneration is integrated into everything you do. I suspect you're in that same position. I'm focusing on capital expenditure.
Yes. Well, we actually have a capital budget for regeneration of 5 to 6 million, but let's address your question. It's always good to get a question from a lawyer, because they're usually pretty testing.
I'm not a lawyer.
Are you not?
I'm a mathematician.
Oh, you're a mathematician? I think that's worse.
I count things.
Well, you'll be able to count
You've
easily.
just insulted the committee, or at least one member.
I apologise, Stuart, for that. If we didn't have a regeneration department and if we didn't have a regeneration budget, we would need to go back and look at our capital plans. Because remember, I said to you that the Council's policy was to concentrate our funding in those most deprived areas. So we're replacing every single secondary and primary school in the whole of South Lanarkshire. Now, that has been done based on the condition of the school. We would need to go back and look at that, because if we didn't have the ability to put money into regeneration, we would need to make a decision what was being started first. Now, as in many of the areas where we're looking at regeneration, the issues in the schools are far greater, we would be investing there first. It would be the same with the housing. We're fortunately not in that position. Now, that would be a political decision. It's not something I'm going to ask Jim about. That would be something that me and my colleagues of all parties would need to sit down and look at. Now, this situation is not going to change unless politicians make qualitative decisions about putting money into these areas and continuing to do it over a long period of time. I hope those figures add up for the mathematician.
That's helpful. Perhaps Councillor Evans, your officials said that you're specifically highlighted building new schools. Would those schools be built if you had no regeneration strategy? Because just the whole general thing is a lot of things get badged regeneration, and I'm starting from a point of some deep scepticism about that. Absolutely here to be persuaded.
Well, to be honest, we don't really have to pretend not to have a regeneration budget or a regeneration committee, because we don't. And I think, like the majority of capital budgets, it's based on, it's assigned to the greatest need. And we have two big school projects going on at the moment in Brechin and in Forfar, both community hubs. But they wouldn't have been possible, and they weren't planned for. I mean, that was through the government that we were able to go ahead with those projects. And I would say that we do have some money assigned in the budget for regeneration, but that's purely through other projects that we've had to bid for. So if it hadn't been for money from the Townscape Heritage Initiative, we wouldn't have been able to regenerate the centre of Brechin. And if it hadn't been for the Conservation Area Regeneration Scheme, we were successful in funding for that for Kirriemuir, we wouldn't be able to go ahead with that either. These were things that weren't in the capital plan and weren't budgeted for, but that we've had to make allowance for because we were successful in bidding for those funds.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Stevenson, the non-lawyer, and now to turn to a lawyer. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Thinking it was as well, you didn't call our mathematician here a banker. Financial fact, I remember he was a former banker.
He would deny that as well, but let's not go there.
Okay.
Mrs. Mitchell.
Yeah. Can I tease out a little bit about the community-led regeneration? You've talked about encouraging, you've talked about including them in the process. I wonder to what extent you think the CPPs in your area have supported community-led regeneration.
So we're going to start with Councillor O'Neill.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have, in terms of the emerging process on about community empowerment renewal bill, within Western Bartonshire, we've developed a new framework for community engagement. We have a citizens panel which we're trying to augment, and we have public reassurance initiatives. We undoubtedly, as most people within this room, we always struggle to connect with young people and get them actively involved, because we don't want to always go down the line of it's older folk, and I'm probably getting into that age frame now, that it's the same folk who are showing up, who are putting in a huge amount of effort across a whole swathe of different committees and communities. And how do we involve our young people in that, and how do we engage young people through social media, etc. So we're looking at how we extend our citizens panel, how we look at best practice nationally, to try, in particular, not only our young people who are our young communities of today, but will be our older communities in the future. We have a current community participation committee within Western Bartonshire, which we have brought, many members of community onto that from a number of relevant community structures, and brought them all together to influence the agenda that we as politicians deliver. So we're looking at new community involvement within, we have 6 distinct wards, so we've brought them into 6 distinct neighbourhoods, and we're looking at involving the community greater in that. Well, one of the issues that we currently have, and certainly in terms of the Community Empowerment Renewal Bill, is how we engage effectively with communities, and who would be that point of contact. Legitimately, would it be a community council? Would it be another organisation? One of the issues that we have, not only in Western Bartonshire and beyond, is how active are our community councils? How effective are our community councils? So a lot of work is being put in, and we would encourage as many people within Western Bartonshire to be part of their community council. And to, what we don't want is, some people who have came to surgeries of mine, it's the same people who have been involved in the community council since its inception. you know, when the Local Government Act was enabled, and you know, and we don't want, by all means, we wish to harness the experience and the knowledge that people have within those communities, but we also need to freshen them up and hear from other folk and what can be done. So we're looking at a whole wave or swathe of measures that can be taking place and will take place, and have community involvement throughout in that.
Margaret?
So if a local organisation or a group of people had an idea for what they thought was a good community initiative, how would they get that to you? How would the council be aware of this?
You thought you'd just teed that question up for me there, Margaret. What we have done is, as part of a disposal strategy, we've got a number of community facilities where probably going to be closed, probably going to be demolished. So within my own ward, within the Dundalk and within Kilpatrick, a whole collective of local folk said that they didn't want to lose this community facility. So they came together and formed a steering committee, and with the assistance of the Provost McAllister, and lots of officers within the council, including CLD officers, education, regeneration officers, looked at the feasibility of how they could take over the running of this facility within the village of Dundalk. And I'm delighted to say that only a few months ago it was handed over to the community, and they have taken on the ownership, they have taken on the whole responsibility. It doesn't come without its challenges, but they've all stepped up to the mark, and they wish to have this facility, and it would probably been something that we as a council or as officers or councillors would have made a decision just to close a building that was costing too much or wasn't delivering. So it's now bright and shiny and is being used day and daily.
So to go back to my original question then, you wouldn't necessarily see, given all the things you're saying that you're doing to engage with the community, you wouldn't necessarily see CPPs as being the main driver for community-led
No, I would, it's definitely plays a major part in it. I wouldn't say it was the main.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if we can move on to Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Margaret. In South Lanarkshire, the community groups are involved right through the whole process of making decisions right up to the CPP. The thinking is not doing things for people, but doing things with people. Now, that we use a number of different ways to do that. Community building, capacity building that we're doing in the 5% worst areas. The regeneration partnership that I mentioned earlier, where the decisions on many of these things are made. The voluntary organisations in the local communities actually sit on that. The leader programme in the rural areas, again, they sit on that to make decisions. The voluntary action group that we've set up, VASLAN in South Lanarkshire, again represent them. They're all round the table and they all can put their views and their wishes directly to the CPP. And of course, let's not forget Clyde Gateway, the urban regeneration company. The important thing here for us at the moment is to continue to build the capacity in some of these areas, Margaret. That capacity we're doing by setting up action groups, youth groups, community-led projects. As Councillor O'Neill mentioned earlier, there will be certain things in communities that attract people to come along. Sometimes it's an environmental project, it can be cleaning up spaces, it could be a number of things. It could be a garden scheme, it could be about youth unemployment, but it's actually honing in on the things that they see as being important and then bringing the CPP strength to be able to do something like that, to do something about it. One of the things we're doing regularly now is drop in an advice centres in some of the community hubs where we will sit down with the community who want advice. How do we do this? How do we do that? What's the next step do we take? Where we have officers that go along who will advise them on exactly the steps they need to take, and then those officers then feed back to the council as well. So part of the capacity building is to encourage them to get involved, to encourage them then to come up with projects that they believe that should be going forward. And the challenge for us then is to be able to fund those and to put them into a programme. But for the moment, we're getting very good response from the communities that are there. But I do stress that we do need to build a capacity in these communities to ensure that they have the knowledge, the skills, to be able to take it to the next step. And somebody mentioned earlier about attracting outside funding, which is then going to be so important for them. It's about giving them back a bit of confidence. It's about giving them the ownership of that community that they live in, and about seeing the council as being somebody who tries to serve their needs and who supports and helps them.
Right, that sounds very good. Can I give you a practical example? A lot of the communities see buildings, community assets that the council own at present. We dearly love to use these, to hire these, to have the use of them, but sometimes it's safe and health and safety reasons are put forward for not giving them access to these buildings after hours sometimes, or during the day if possible, or the charges are prohibitive. Could you comment on that specific aspect? Because that's something tangible.
Very briefly, Councillor Thompson, because we've got a lot to go through here. So if you could answer that very briefly, please.
We're very keen to work with them in that. We have a community asset transfer scheme to try and help people where they want to take over the assets.
Not talking about taking over. It's owned by the local authority. They're running it, but there's spare capacity in terms of being able to use that facility. Very often they're not able to.
We're only too happy to work with them on that, Margaret. If you know of these, please flag them up to us and we'll look at it very, very carefully, because if there is spare capacity and we can find a way of making sure that the community benefit from it, we will do that.
Okay, thank you. And this about the CPPs.
Well, thank you. Well, it was just off the back of your last question. I mean, that's exactly what we're doing just now. I mean, for example, we have vacant buildings throughout Angus that we're actually just letting community groups use and have the use of, because, well, if they're on the market, if they're vacant, we're not doing anything with it anyway, so it's what's the point in it sitting there doing nothing when we could have people utilising that space and putting it to good use. Again, it's just about working with the community groups, seeing what they need and seeing if we can help facilitate that. But to be honest, I think while I'm in administration now, I was in opposition in the council the last term, and to me it just seemed like there was a massive breakdown in the strategic level community planning partnership and what was actually happening with local community planning on the ground. There was a big disconnect there, and it seemed that community planning was only as good as the local officer you had in your ward, and if you had a good one, oh, they made a big difference, but if you had a bad one, nothing happened and you heard nothing but complaints about them. And I couldn't have told you what the strategic level community planning partnership discussed. I couldn't tell you the outcomes of that. It's only as I get more involved in it now I can see, and that's what we're working on, is how we tie what people need at the most local level with the strategic level too, and how we can help bring all that together. But yeah, you'll probably hear me mention it again, like I mentioned before. I mean, Brechin is pretty much our flagship example of how community planning works now. Pretty much Regeneration in Brechin kicked off from the Townscape Heritage Initiative. That was £3 million worth of funding that was mainly, we had a rundown town centre, but with that funding, I mean, it gave the whole place a new lease of life. But it's something that people in Brechin did have to be dragged along a bit, kicking and screaming. They couldn't see the purpose in it at first. But from that, we brought in retailing experts from the Merchant City in Glasgow, who helped get our retailers group together, looking at how they could improve Brechin. And from that, it's just continued to snowball. They've set up a number of events throughout the year. It's completely changed the way that Brechiners think about the place that they live. And instead of being the place that they always moan about, it's a place that, well, actually, we've got a lot to offer and there's a lot to get excited about here. And that's been primarily led through, and that's been supported by community planning the whole way along. They've been that facilitator and that support to them. And it's also, but it just so happened as well, we had a really, our community council reformed, so we had a whole new group of positive thinking people there. So between the local partnership, the community council, the retailers group and the local community planning and the support we had from that, it's really completely changed Brechin. And as I say, that's the flagship, and we're hoping to build on that for and spread that across Angus now.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I think there's a point that needs to be made around the wider community planning partnership and some of the frictions between some national agendas around disposal of NHS land through the disposals book, for example, and how that contributes or doesn't contribute to the strategic alignment just now. So if we've got old hospital sites that we would like to do something with by way of either, for example, housing sites that meet a wider regeneration objective, or look at, for example, developing a centre of excellence for training. But the big swathe of the land is in the NHS, but the NHS disposal strategy is set centrally, so therefore our local NHS partners don't have much of an ability to influence over that and to tie that in. That's a gap in not just Angus's overall desire, but it's a gap, I think, it's something the committee may want to explore, and whether or not we can actually structurally align properly if we don't then follow through with some of those disposal strategies and other rules. I can remember when community planning was first starting out when I worked in COSLA, that was one of the key goals: get the NHS, get the local government, get the police, get fire, get the voluntary sector, all strategically and budgetally aligned at the same time, then we've got a chance for success.
Thank you for that.
I think that's very useful, Mr McEwan, and I don't want to go around the table because we'll probably get lots and lots of local aspects of this. But if you want to send us in where those difficulties have arisen, then again, that would be very, very useful. Richard Baker, please.
I'm also interested in how we maximise investment in regeneration and what policy changes can be brought about to incentivise that. And South Lanarkshire's submission talked about the procurement processes and specifically referred to challenges in procurement processes at the moment, because obviously procurement's one area where council spend can be used to maximise investment in regeneration, also leaving in private partners too. So I wonder what you thought could be done, specifically to Councillor Thompson, given it's in your submission. What's being achieved through that at the moment, and what more could be achieved. I mean, you referred to the forthcoming procurement bill and challenges that exist currently. I mean, what kind of changes need to be made there to ensure that through council procurement we can maximise investment in regeneration?
To give very brief answers from now on in, because I've got a huge amount of questions to get through here. Councillor Thompson.
I think you've been speaking to the Leader of the Council again about brief answers. The procurement bill, I think there's a number of things that you can look at. A number of these refer to the clauses that we can place within those bills. One's about things like living wages. Another is about being able to take on apprentices, and about recruiting in the areas of highest deprivation. Now, we've been more than reasonably successful, but we've worked on this for 10 years through the Supplier Development Programme, and the Government's Procurement Department are now looking at the Supplier Development Programme to roll it out nationally as part of a wider piece of work, which I would congratulate them on. I think there's far more that can be done. If we could take the spend, if we can tie up our employability, our regeneration and our economic development strategy into our procurement strategy, then we are going to get far bigger hits for our buck. Now, it's important that we do that. Again, Chair, if you're caught for time, we can put in a submission on that. As I said, it's been a 10-year piece of work involved in winning the hearts and minds, quite often of procurement professionals.
Very briefly, because I know we're short of time, are you confident that these goals are going to be achieved through the forthcoming procurement bill? Is there the kind of dialogue that needs to be between local authorities and Scottish Government on that legislation, which is due later this year, or certainly in the near future, that will ensure that that new legislative framework will be there to help achieve the goals that you set out?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think the government is listening to what we're seeing out there. They're doing their absolute best, but of course we've got to remember that there's a European legislation that we've got to balance as part of this. But I think we've got to push the boundaries as far as we can, and there's some very good models south of the border, particularly in areas of London, that we can look at.
I wonder, Councillor Thompson, you talked about the Council's procurement department there. Now, some of us had the opportunity to visit Clyde Gateway in recent times, and they seemed to be able to deal with some procurement issues that others felt that were an impediment. That's my own impression of what they said. What's the cooperation between South Lanarkshire's procurement department, as you call it, and the work that's going on at Clyde Gateway in terms of procurement?
not just Clyde Gateway, but the whole process of the council. The procurement department have been given very specific instructions by the council, by the chief executive and by the elected members that it is absolutely necessary for them to be able to bring on local suppliers. If we need to build their capacity, we'll do that using our economic development budget, that their suppliers must use our work programs. Now, some of it we can put in legislation, some of it we can't. In fact, we've worked very closely with Clyde Gateway on how they procure, and their model looks very similar to the one that we use. So we're very supportive of them. We believe that there is a way forward in this, and it's one that we can't miss. It's a very important one.
Okay, does anyone else want to talk about procurement? I do hope that you will all become involved in the consultation for the bill, because I think that's extremely important. Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. I've got one question for each of the local authorities. The first one is to Angus Council. In your written submission, you talk about the regeneration policy in Scotland. It needs to anticipate and respond to changing patterns of behaviour. You then go on to highlight issues of behavioural change in terms of smoking, obesity, alcohol, etc. Are there any particular actions that you're undertaking within the local authority to actually help facilitate that change at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's what, when I talked about at the beginning about hard to pinpoint budgets and identify spending, I mean, we're trying to make massive steps in that direction in terms of socially tackling obesity, tackling poverty, and we're doing that through a lot of early intervention projects, but that's done in conjunction with community planning and working with the third sector as well. Voluntary Action Angus is a key partner. We're looking at the most deprived areas in Angus and working together to see how we can tackle that.
Would it be possible to send the committee some further information on that, a bit more detailed information?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. To South Lanarkshire Council, Councillor Thompson, in the written submission, on the first page of the submission to answer to question 1, you talk about also it was the issue of the EU Structural Programme 2014-20, and you go on to say that programmes such as these are developed increasingly looking at areas of opportunity. Then there is a potential for regeneration projects and jobs to move to relatively wealthy and successful areas. This seems to tie in, I would suggest, with the submission that we received from Scottish Enterprise, which also we'll be hearing from an SE rep later on, where they indicate that clear priorities are not only important for maximising the impact of public sector spend, they also send a strong message to the private sector about where public investment is most likely to enhance the conditions for the private sector, making the returns on investment sufficiently attractive. These two statements, as I suggest, are actually quite similar. Do you think that that there possibly is too much investment to kind of the larger areas and kind of the more affluent areas as compared to areas of deprivation?
I think it's about getting a balance is important here. I'm interested that Scottish Enterprise and South Lanarkshire take the same view. It just goes to show that partnership does work in this case. I think one of the things we're going to be very careful of, Stuart, is the layers of policies within departments and the creation of silos in some of this. We've got to be very, very clear on exactly what we're doing, whether it's at a council level, Scottish Enterprise or Scottish Government level. And we've got to get the balance of investment right. If there is a fair bit of investment, Clyde Gateway is a very good example where you've a lot of public money going in. We have got to persuade the private sector to come in and give them the confidence that they can put in private money, because the public sector, with the best will in the world, can't do it all themselves. Our job should be to stimulate it, should be to get it started, and then hopefully get the private sector to be able to take it from there. It's not an easy ask in this particular economic situation, but we're beginning to see some of that in Clyde Gateway. We're beginning to see some of that in other areas, but we've got to get a balance of how we spend our money, where we spend our money, and that it attracts private sector funding to come in the back of it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor O'Neill, you mentioned earlier in terms of the meeting that's taking place this afternoon, regarding the potential kind of benefit for a regeneration project, and also to do with education and the school. So I'm not going to ask a political question, but it's just a kind of technical question. If the decision does go ahead, so I'm led to believe that there's potentially that there may be a kind of joint procurement operation between Western Berkshire Council and another authority for schools.
Is it East Renfrewshire? We're about 3 months behind East Renfrewshire in terms of the procurement. We would save on costs. Within Western Berkshire, we received 66% of the funding from the Scottish Government, and we came up with the other capital monies. So we're working with a joint procurement model with East Renfrewshire, and the work will be done and the drawings will be done at the same time. Because we are slightly behind them, there's some benefit for Western Berkshire because we will learn by their quick mistakes and hopefully pick on that. But we are hoping, and obviously a decision will be made by an education committee this afternoon in terms of what happens in particular sites.
Would there be any potential kind of financial implications if there was any further slippage in procurement and moving ahead with the programme?
It's contained just now. If there's a particular site that is maybe selected that the community is against, as one of the preferred, there's an officer recommendation for a particular site. There's quite a swell within the community against that particular bit of greenbelt being used.
Into far too local policy decision making, as far as I'm concerned here.
I appreciate it, but in terms, I will finish then in terms that as it stands just now, there won't be slippage, so we won't fall behind.
Okay. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. The establishment and the measurement of regeneration outcomes has been quite varied from what we've heard this morning. Would you welcome an approach established around people's well-being? To any one of them.
Go first here.
Absolutely. Well, we're working more towards an outcomes-based approach anyway through community planning, and I think that would be something that we would absolutely welcome. I think because a lot of the funding that's come now, while it's been diverted, it tends to be to shorter term projects, which are then obviously easier to slice at budget time. And a lot of the time you can't see it could have a positive impact 10 years down the line, but you're not getting the chance to properly evaluate and assess that. So I'd welcome that.
Mr. Thompson.
And thank you for the question. We do a residence survey which has that included. We've been doing that since 2007. We did one in 2007, 2009, 2011. So the other one is due this year at some point. So we do look at that. And I think the background to your question is quite right. We need to measure what we're doing to see what outcomes that we're getting from this. And we need to measure what's happening out in those communities. And the best way to do that is to ask the people who live there.
Councillor O'Neill.
Certainly, we very much see in terms of regeneration and community well-being. If we don't have jobs, if we don't have regeneration, if we don't have people socially interacting, we won't have healthy communities and safe communities. So we very much look at the whole mix of regeneration and all those benefits that come from it. If somebody has a job, they feel better about themselves, they feel better about their children, etc., etc. And that continues. And it's not a rocket scientist, but it will have that domino effect. The community well-being is at the heart of it.
Thank you. Okay.
That's me, thanks.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Convener, I must apologise. I'm going to start with a question that may be localised, but I'm trying to generalise it in terms of the issues that have been raised today.
Give it a bash, and we'll see.
Councillor O'Neill, you made reference to community asset transfer in Dundalk. You indicated that the facility is now being used day and daily because it's been run by the community. Can I ask why you think the facility wasn't being used day and daily when it was under the control of the council? And what was the difference that's been made to make it be used more frequently by the community?
Councillor O'Neill.
I will hesitate in terms of being political. I don't think we were using our assets appropriately and using them. You know, there was undoubtedly a cost implication, and as under the previous administrations, as they were closing or trying to close budgets, there was an element, and I hear from my colleague in Brecon, in terms of facilities that are not being used, that they're being used by communities. And I would hope, and certainly strive as a vice convener, that we would look upon these things, that if a community, we have reduced some of the charges within some community facilities within Western Bartonshire, or brought them into line, because we had a number of pricing regimes that even go back to Region days. So we have tried to bring them all together, and in the main, probably about 95% of the charges were reduced within Western Bartonshire.
I thank Councillor O'Neill for his response, and I think it shows that communities can operate facilities and operate them successfully, which leads to the argument about community asset transfer being of benefit to communities. Councillor Thompson, you made great play of the schools improvement programme, and according to the written report, basically that programme of upgrading or new build has almost been complete. You indicated that where you've worked with local contractors to try and create local jobs and local apprenticeships, how successful has that programme been? And what will be the long-term monitoring carried out to ensure that those people who have been employed in those contracts gain meaningful employment into the future?
Thank you very much. It has been very successful indeed, because the contractors use our employability schemes to be able to carry out their recruitment. We support many of them with job subsidies and with training, and the recent figures show that over 90% of them are still in full-time employment a year after they've finished the scheme. So it is a very, very good scheme indeed. Just looking at some of the figures, we're talking here about people from through our Skills Academy in construction, from 14 to 16, right up through the whole process, and you're talking probably 100 people who have got jobs through that particular process. That's over and above those who are adult, who have went in through the other schemes and who have come in using job subsidies. So it has been a very successful scheme. And the good news for us, John, is that the contractors like it. They find it very useful, it reduces their costs, and it gives them community ownership of what's happening out there. So it is working, but it's not a cheap option.
Thank you. Final question, Convener, is to Councillor Evans. Councillor Evans, you made reference to revamping of community councils in Angus, and you made the comment about engaging with positive thinking people. Could you define how you engage with people who don't think positively, particularly people who may be critical of the regeneration strategies and policies of the local authority? And that may apply, well, I'm not going to ask the rest of the panel that question today, may apply to the rest of the panel about how do you tackle the issue of people who question what is being done, particularly people who have been around for many decades and have seen things being done to them rather than things being done with them?
Councillor Evans.
Well, I think there's a lot of elected members in this room, so I'm sure we're all quite used to meeting people that don't think positively about us, let alone what we think. But yeah, there was just, like I say, the physical degeneration that we had sparked a seed change in people, so that a general feeling that everybody was fed up with the way that things had been before. And I think that it took a bit of that work. Like I say, there was a lot of negative thinking at the start. People complaining that they didn't seem like there was an awful lot happening. Then they complained when the scaffolding went up. It was only when the actual results were seen after that, like I say, there was just a general attitude change. And I think that because more and more people started to talk about our city in a positive way. I think that it snowballed from there, so that it was a big sweep towards overall. I mean, you'll always get negative people, no matter what you do, and people will always criticise your whatever we try to do, or certain policies, and it's only when they see the effects of it after that, you know, they then change their opinion. And I think it's just being consistent until you see the final results of it.
Convener, as I said, there's 3 brief questions, but it's an issue that people may wish to reflect on. It's how you engage with people in the start of the process may assist in taking people along the route of travel or direction of travel that you're aiming to end up in, rather than trying to fight again. Because one of the big issues, Convener, is for many communities, as I said, they feel they're getting things done to them rather than done with them. And I think that's where you may get the negative thinking at the start of the process. But thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I want to touch upon one brief point, and obviously, having been out and about, and we have seen the cross-boundary cooperation in terms of Clyde Gateway, which involve 2 local authorities and a lot of other partner agencies. I want to get some indications about how you deal with some cross-local authority boundary regeneration schemes. Councillor Evans, knowing your own neck of the woods, for example, if I'm right in thinking that you represent Edzell 2, and obviously there is Edzell Air Base, which is in Aberdeenshire. How do you ensure that you cooperate with other local authorities to create the right climate for regeneration in these cross-border areas, as has been done in Clyde Gateway?
Well, I suppose it's quite hard because on the other side we border with a city, so obviously our needs are quite different there. But to be honest, I think, Aberdeenshire, I think it's a place that we could be working closer with, but I don't think that relationship is 100% there at the moment in terms of regeneration. I feel like our regeneration seems to be feels quite localised at the moment, I think. I don't know if Mr McEwan has a different opinion to that.
I understand that, but sometimes, you know, local authority boundaries, and I'll come to Councillor O'Neill next in terms of Western Bartonshire, you know, there are areas which go across local authority areas where obviously the effects or the effects of regenerating or not regenerating are felt across those boundaries. And what I'm trying to establish is how we get to a point where there is discussion between local authorities, as there has been in Clyde Gateway, so that, you know, communities on these boundaries actually don't miss out in some regeneration prospects. Mr McEwan.
From our perspective, it's the regional planning approach. So in Angus, it's the TAPE plan approach, where we start off with that strategic planning discussion between officials and elected members. That's helping us make sure we bridge that gap between, say, a boundary of Dundee and a boundary of Angus. You've
opened up another can of worms, because obviously you're involved in TAPE plan, and Edzell Air Base is involved in the Aberdeen City and Shire plan. Yeah. So again, I would say, how is there cooperation in that regard?
It could be as simple as we walked in here, we met the Chief Executive of Aberdeenshire Council, and we've agreed to meet up, catch up and have a conversation about shared services and regeneration activities. And at one level, it's as simple as having good personal relationships and making use of those, and then bringing in elected members and vice versa as elected members talk to each other and sharing that. And I think that world is opening up much more now than it ever has in the past. And we've got to make those opportunities and make them work for us. And at one level, it's as simple as that.
Okay. Councillor O'Neill.
Again, Convener, we, by our position, we do a lot of work with Argyll and Bute and Stirling as the 3 boundaries meet, and we also have the National Park Authority at Loch Lomond and Trossachs. So as well as, you know, as well as the Vice Convener of Regeneration and the Conveners of Planning and Licensing, and I also sit on the community, the Clyde Valley joint community planning, our local development planning group. So we've got Clyde Waterfront, and we do lots of joint work, and most recently the marine accident investigation. There was a boat sank on Loch Lomond. I'm appreciative of time, and the boat was unregulated.
Councillor O'Neill, I think we're drifting because we're talking about regeneration. I want to talk about the regeneration aspects of cross-border cooperation, if you like.
Well, it's probably the Clyde Valley, both in terms of community planning and in terms of the joint development group, and we're also working the Clyde and Loch Lomond flood prevention group, which I am the vice convener of, in terms of some work that we're doing with SEPA and with the local authorities that are adversely affected by flooding.
Okay. Apart from Clyde Gateway, Councillor Thompson, do you have anything else you wish to say in that regard?
We do. Our old friends in North Lanarkshire, where again we have a very good relationship with, particularly on regeneration, looking at what we term as routes to inclusion, from where people are to where they're going. We sit down regularly. It's politically led, and then below the political leadership is an officer group that sits on it. We look at business development, business gateway, which again has some fit to it, and in the rural area, very importantly, tourism, which again fits into regeneration. So we sit round the table with them. We're also involved in the Clyde Valley Community Planning Partnership, but as I said, it is politically led, just as it was in Clyde Gateway, as it is in Glasgow. The politicians meet. We look at what our shared values are. We then have the officers that sit below that advises. And partnership with the other local authorities is working well. It's working well with Scottish Enterprise, who are sitting at the back of me, and they'll probably give me a scalp if I didn't say that, but it is, and with Skills Development Scotland and with NHS. We don't always get what we don't want. We don't always agree. But we share those problems, we argue out a common way forward, and then we stick to it.
Thank you very much for your evidence today. I hope that we'll get some feedback on some of the points that have been made. Thank you. I suspend for a couple of minutes for a change of witnesses. Thank you. We now move on to the second panel. I'd like to welcome Rachel McCormick, Director of Strengthening Communities at Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Councillor Thomas Prague, Chair of the Planning, Environment and Development Committee at Highland Council, and Andy McCann, Economy and Regeneration Manager, again at Highland Council. Can I start by asking you if you would like to make any brief opening remarks? Councillor Prague.
I have no intention of making a long opening statement. I'm sure you've got lots of questions, but just perhaps to remind people tend to think of the Highlands as rural, and perhaps we should remind, it's not maybe helpful to remind you that we have some urban deprivation areas as well, quite significant ones, and also perhaps to draw your attention to something in our evidence which is about how you work with communities and whether it's a public sector-led, community-led, and we tend towards the middle path. In other words, it could be either. But that's really all that needs saying. I think you'll no doubt grill us with other difficult questions.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure most of us are aware that not all of Highland is rural. Many of us will have visited the great city of Inverness and some of the other urban areas of your authority. You know, I think in terms of tourism, a lot of us have been here, there and everywhere. But I think that's very useful because sometimes we do see local authorities either being as urban or rural. So thank you for that. Can I start off by asking, and you know, we have the two of you here, the Council and Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I would imagine that many of your regeneration budgets are joint budgets. Maybe you can give us an indication of that cooperation, how much you are actually spending on regeneration activity, and again, what proportion of that budget is spent on community-led regeneration. Councillor Pragg, do you want to go first?
Yes, but I'm going to rely on my colleagues here quite a bit.
Fair play, sir.
I heard that question asked before and thought I only wish I'd had that question beforehand because we could have done that homework for you. The difficulty I have is identifying what is a regeneration budget in many cases. Frankly, so much of what we're doing is about communities, about regeneration anyway. It's the additional bits. There are bits, though. I mean, we can point fingers at things like a relatively small fund for us, a community challenge fund, which we've introduced, which is encouraging communities to come to us with ideas of where they can perhaps do the service better, where they can work with us and so on, produce some very interesting ideas. And we have a preventative spend budget as well. These are relatively small things that I can immediately identify. And Mr. McCann can probably give you a list of some of the sums, though. He's had a chance to think about that.
Okay. Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I think one of the things we were very keen to point out is the Highland Leader programme, which we've been very active in. I mean, that's a £16.5 million programme in Highland. Yes, it's European cash, and yes, it's matched with some Scottish Government funding, but there's also been £5 million matched come in from the Council on the various, there's 350 projects that have been funded through that. So again, it's that bit of where, yes, there's been external funding come in, but it's how the Council has identified spend for that. The Council also has £1 million discretionary spend for each of the wards, and again, very much active at the community level and supporting community projects on that. And I think also, again, another example being our employability budget, where we are spending just over just under £2.5 million. We've got ESF funding as well on top of that. But actually, a part of that is about just under £500,000, which is directed to deprived area funds to support community projects, again, which is linked into employability. So again, like as Councillor Pragg has said, there's a wide range of activity that we've got, and of course, happy to pull together some further details for you if you wish.
In terms of the leader money, which, as you say, is mainly European, and you've mentioned European Social Fund money there as well, how much European money are we talking about that you have got to play with, as were?
Well, as I said, there's the LEADER programme, which was the £16.5 million one, which was in LEADER and convergence funding. ESF funding for employability activity, we've pulled down £1 million of that more recently. We've also just pulled down just £80,000 from the Scottish Government for a particular employment initiative that's just come along this last time. I think there's obviously the Council's pulled down other wider funds, ERDF funds as well. And indeed we have the European Fisheries Fund, which is there again, which is again supporting community activity, and again that's just under £500,000.
Okay, I think again that would be very useful for us to get our heads around. Ms McCormack.
Highlands and Islands Enterprise and our predecessor organisation, HIDB, have been in establishment for a period spanning 5 decades now. And going back to the 60s, HIDB and HI today was given a remit of social and economic development. And that's a very distinctive characteristic of our organisation. What it means is that we interlace and combine approaches to social development and economic development. So in terms of an answer to the question about how much we spend on regeneration, depending on how you define regeneration, that would probably be all of it. In as much as that, the focus of the work of Highlands and Islands Enterprise is to support communities, businesses and social enterprises in the Highlands and Islands region to grow, to be ambitious and to reach their aspirations.
Thank you. Margaret Mitchell, please.
Good morning. I wonder if we could tease out how, in practical terms, Highland Island Enterprise and Highland Council coordinate their regeneration strategy and activity, given all the funding you've talked about, given the shared aims, to ensure that there isn't duplication and that you do have value for money.
Ms. McCormick.
Could I just clarify for the benefit of the committee the relationship that Highlands and Islands Enterprise has with all of the local authorities within the region, one of which is the Highland Council, but we also work with colleagues in Murray, in Shetland, in Orkney, in Inchregal, in Argyll and Bute, and we have a little bit of crossover with North Ayrshire. And I hope I've not missed anybody. But we work with a range of local authority partners at a strategic level. Senior colleagues within the executive of Highlands and Islands Enterprise sit on community planning partnership boards for each of our CPPs within our area. And in terms of strategic alignment, that's an extremely valuable mechanism. What I would like to do, though, is give you an example of a community account management programme. I can see there's a hunger for some numbers, and I would be able to share with you in some detail both the numbers in terms of the contribution that HI makes, the mechanism of collaboration, but also the contributions that are made by all of those local authority partners and a number of other partners to principally support community-led regeneration, if that's of interest, Convener.
Yes. Go ahead, Ms. McCormick.
For a number of years, Highlands and Islands Enterprise has supported community-led regeneration in a very specific way. At the moment, we term that community account management, which is where we work with a whole community within a particular location. The community identifies and establishes themselves. And we provide support and resources, some access to finance, but we also bring together other agencies around that community so that that community can benefit directly from specific support. They have a long-term relationship with Highlands and Islands Enterprise staff. We have expertise within our community assets team and our community growth communities policies team. We also have strengthening communities teams within each of our 8 area teams. So wherever you are in the Highlands and Islands region as a community, you're not very far away from an area office or a local office with high staff that have a community-led regeneration focus. The account management process in terms of numbers and financials for you. We've done an interim review. It's a rolling programme, and we've done an interim review from when the account management process was started proper in 2009. A cumulative investment of £4.6 million, of which high funding was just over 2.7 million, and of which leader funding via our local authority, the leader lags, was 1.8 million. In addition, Shetland Isles Council made a further contribution, as did the Orkney Isles Council, one of the national parks, and a number of other agencies have given in-kind contributions as well. So it's something of an exemplar in terms of multi-agency working and a partnership approach to locally led community regeneration. And the community approach is one where it's very much I tend to distance myself from the phrase bottom-up because I don't agree with that as a principle. I don't think that's right. Community-led is a much more accurate description of community-led development and regeneration. And the starting point is the community coming together around a common need or a shared aim or a desire to do something. Sometimes that's because there's a threat of something happening that they don't want to see. We support them to become constituted. We support them with some initial grant monies to allow them to spread their wings a little bit, determine for themselves what it is that they want to do and the trajectory that they want to go on. We support them to do far-reaching community engagement. And when I say far-reaching, we would look for 60, 70, 80% representation, if that's at all possible. And I was at a presentation from the Machrihanish Air Base Community Company recently, and they were talking about 70 or 80% representation, thousands of people in their community participating in that early stage consultation, very significant indeed. I think the difference is because it's community-led as opposed to agency-led. We support an assets audit, so an inventory of what's available to us as a community, what might we want to do differently as a community, and then a prioritisation exercise which leads to what we term a growth plan, but it's basically a shared development plan. And where we do guide that, and where I think it's very important that we do give that direction, is to help communities to identify those things that are going to increase their resilience in the long term. So if we want to do something over here or something over there, if one of those has got an income stream associated with it going forward, that would most likely be the one that we would be guiding the community towards in terms of where it's going to put its resource going forward. Because grant dependency is not a position that our communities want to be in, and it's not sustainable in terms of the current public sector purse either.
So in terms of making sure there isn't the duplication, would it be that interim review to which you referred to and account management, that you were having the checks and balances to make sure you aren't duplicating anything that's already being done in the council, or one of the various councils that you've mentioned that Highland and the Islands work with, which is a lot to keep a handle on?
It certainly is. I'm fortunate that I have an extremely capable staff, and I have a range of colleagues that work directly with partner agencies, and this isn't all for hire to deliver, absolutely not. This is community-led. This is an umbrella, a framework, if you like, that Highlands and Islands Enterprise provides, but we are reliant on and share that responsibility for delivery with colleagues, such as colleagues here today from the Highland Council, but without other local authority partners, with health authority partners, and the list goes on in terms of the multi-agency nature of it. The community account relationship is the responsibility of HIE, in as much as that we provide the staff resource that has the long-term relationship and brings the expertise and provides not core support to that organisation, but is there. I mean, we're there if you need us. We're there for the good times when development is going strong. We're there for the bad times, but we're there for the long haul. In talking to communities, it's that relationship, not the finance. They always say the finance is nice, but if you were to ask them to say what's most important, it's the relationship with our expert staff who bring a huge amount of experience and can really expedite significant change in communities for the benefit of a whole inclusive community, not just the community anchor organisation with which we work.
Councillor Thompson from the council's
Councillor Prague.
That's right. I'm used to being called lots of things.
Thomas Prague, sorry, Councillor Prague.
Such a short name, so difficult. Just at the top level, if you're talking about how do we work together, I think I can go back long enough in the area, long before I was involved with the council, when the relationship frankly wasn't all that good and it was competitive, which was even worse. That's before all of our time, I'm delighted to say. But what exists at the moment is, firstly of all, a single outcome agreement, which has been very helpful to focus minds and to focus us on what the outcomes need to be and who's responsible for them. And that is working much better for us now. We have things like the Highland Economic Forum. The Highland Economic Forum is a joint, has all kinds of bodies on it, but we don't just meet as a talking shop. We have targets and we say, who's going to do that? I chair that as it happens, hire part of that, as are many other appropriate organisations. And we have a joint economic recovery plan. The council, top of its programme for this session has been the economy and what to do about it, and we developed that partly. But actually, that's now being taken, the detail is some of that's been taken on by HIE, and we work together. We had a meeting a few weeks ago about where bits of that is going. So, and there are more practical examples, if you like. Mr. McCann could probably give you an example around the work done around the NIG Energy Park and the redevelopment of that. That was a classic example where if partnership working does, you know, it was the only way to deliver that.
Okay. I'm tempted to say it's just something that we do. It's the way we actually work in the Highland. We don't necessarily think of having to make those connections because they're already there, and we do that in an operational sense. If I can just pick up, yes, there's the strategic side of it with the single outcome agreement. But another thing that we're doing just at the moment is as part of through the Highland Community Planning Partnership, there's a cross-agency working group which is sitting down, looking at with the agencies as how we're actually all working together on community development. So that's not just a duplication or addressing the issue of High, it's also what's NHS Highland doing, what's it doing through its district partnerships, what's it doing from health inequalities as well. It's trying to make that connection across the range of agencies, not just Highlands Enterprise. If I also pick up again operational, yes, that was the NIG situation of where we were joint in doing investments there. Again, very, very close work, and there's a lot of issues over state aid. So the real detailed practicality, we had to be there working closely with the officers to make sure that there was not a problem on that. When we were putting together the Highland Leader Programme, High with other partners were integral to the design of that, to the strategy of that, to the operation and delivery of that on the ground. So, as I say, it's something we do, and it's just built into our systems and working practices.
Are there any checks and balances to make sure there isn't any duplication in some of the funding that you might be putting forward, Highland and Enterprise is putting forward? I mean, to ensure that there is no wastage at all, value for money is right up there.
Who wants to tackle that one? Mr. McCann?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, again, I mean, the checks and balances, I mean, again, we come down to individual projects. I mean, I think that's it's a key bit. It's just understanding that project and understanding the finances in there. And I think that's, again, is down to operational mechanisms as to how you do things. It is also some of those mechanisms, for example, the NIG one, that was a very detailed one because of the particular investments issues there and state aid issues and so forth. So that had to be very clear on that. But as I say, otherwise, operational on individual projects like the Leader one, again, that's all identified up front and quite clear as to where the funding is and whether if there's particular outcomes that each of the agencies are looking for, that's captured in the various project outcomes.
Ms. McCormack, you were keen to answer that too.
I think I would just like to echo Andy's point, and I could give a couple of examples. I won't go into the detail here, but just in the course of the last 2 days of where an issue has arisen, and before either we steam in with a view to sorting something out, the first port of call is picking up the phone, and it's at a director-to-director level in the first instance, and then we would encourage colleagues from within respective teams to be having the detailed dialogue. If I say on the way into Edinburgh last night, I pulled into a car park at Wicks because Stuart Black was on the line wanting a chat about something where there's a mutual crossover and we need to collaborate. I don't think I could make that up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to pursue the issue I was pursuing with the previous panel, the essence of which is, particularly in relation to capital expenditure, if we were not engaged in regeneration, what wouldn't we do? Or perhaps, turning it on its head, what are we doing in capital that we're only doing because we're focused on regeneration? To put it positively.
Councillor Prague.
Yes, very good question. I listened to it and was very glad I had a little time to think about it. My father was the mathematician, by the way, in my family, not me. It's a really hard thing to pin down because actually what the regeneration funding does in some cases is advance things or make you do things better. I'm thinking of the city of Inverness at the moment where lots of work is being done. Well, now, for example, there's a big bit of defence, flood defence work being done. Now, that's basically there to stop the river flowing into the city, and we're funding that, Scottish Government's funding that largely and so on. But it's the bits you can do on top of that because you can access other bits of funding to make it that much better and regenerate that part of the city at the same time. So that's why it's really quite difficult to say. you mentioned earlier on about schools. There are areas where a new school might have to be built, but actually if you have access to different funding and better and community thinking, community working together, you can add something to that school. So I can't give you specifics, and it isn't a neat line. Sorry, for a mathematician, I know that's not comfortable, but actually it's very grey.
Mr. McCann?
Within our written evidence, we make reference to one particular project about where the council was investing in a school, and where the council then was aware that the community was very keen for community facilities, but the council in its capital programme wasn't able to provide that. It did provide the space as part of that capital, but actually through the community development activity, that community got together, they did the fit out, they now are involved in the management of that facility. So again, it's maybe not necessarily the capital generating extra capital, but it's how you're using that capital and how they then can create opportunities in this particular instance of where a community then became very active and are now that asset that has been created is not just a council one, but it's very much a community asset.
Can I just come back on that? Are you suggesting then that as a matter of policy, you are using your capital expenditure in a way that will maximise the building of community capacity?
I would say that when there's the opportunity for that, that certainly is what is happening within the council. I don't know, yes. Councillor Prague?
Yes, I haven't thought about it that way, but I think we instinctively do. Yes. It's not, in other words, I don't think it's a written policy, but you would immediately make the most of it from a community point of view. Maybe I've misunderstood.
Are you suggesting, Councillor Park, therefore, that the regeneration issue is so ingrained in everyone that you do not need to speak of it? I come from a point of some slight scepticism on that.
Well, we can always find things to talk about. Is it ingrained? No, it is ingrained. I think it is ingrained. I mean, next week, I'll just give you an example. One of the issues we have around regeneration is we have a lot of small towns, and we have issues around city centres, as everywhere else does. There was a report done for the Scottish Government recently. We had already been thinking about that and about how our city centres need to be different kinds of places. So we have instinctively organised a seminar for our members around that issue for them to think about that. So that's kind of embedded in our thinking. Can I use another example, which is an area where we really want to do something in Inverness, and we've known it for a while, but it really needs regeneration funds, if you like, and that's Academy Street. If anybody who knows Inverness, it's a thoroughfare, it's a problem. It's crying out for significant help, both to some of the buildings, but also maybe to, in my personal view, to look at it in terms of a shared space where vehicles and people can mingle more. So that's the kind of thing that you might want to do. We haven't got capital resources to do that, but we might put something to it, and it's a regeneration of that part of the city. I'm not sure if that's answered your question.
I would probably return to buying my shoes in Inverness if you closed the bank down that replaced the best shoe shop in the whole of the Highlands.
Yes.
But there we are.
We're getting parochial again. Ms McCormick, do you want to add to that at all?
I think it's an interesting challenge, interesting perspective, because I think when we look at capital investment and we look at regeneration objectives, we probably wouldn't describe them like that, but the objectives that we would seek from our community-led development, for example, would be around demographic change, would be around for the better, would be around positive economic activity, would be around increased social participation, services and amenities managed for the community, by the community, positive changes in environment and land management, and a qualitative measure of overall community confidence. The figures that I talked about in terms of high investment of 2 and a bit million plus a little bit more in terms of delivering some of the capital projects that communities sought, we invested a total of nearly 4.5 million over 2 or 3 years, and the leverage that brought was for every pound was £6.6 or £6.60 of other monies levered in. So in a very creative use of capital with a view to having maintaining a focus on what you could describe as regeneration, but what we would describe as a series of linked other outcomes that are beneficial for our communities. Perhaps another way of answering the question would be to say that we also have confidence within our communities to the extent that we are very comfortable placing in their hands some of our most significant chunks of capital in terms of community-led investment. And if I give you an example of Storrs Uist in South Uist and Trallin and Benimora, taking forward a £10 million harbour development, of which over £5 million is a contribution from High, into the hands of a community landlord to take forward a community-led regeneration project that is going to be demonstrably transformational for that part of our region.
Can I just get you to clarify one point there? You said £1 levered in, £6.60, is that right? I didn't quite hear that.
In terms of community investment secured during that period that we looked at, what I would say is that a number of those communities had support from High over preceding periods. Sure. So we just did an interim snapshot evaluation to look at what the spending and the productivity, if you like, out had been during that period, and some fairly significant results. I would be very happy to share that with the committee if that's of interest.
I think that would be of great interest to the committee. Thank you. John Wilson, please.
Just to follow on from that, and that's the issue about the 5 decades that High and HIDB had been around. What impact do you think that's had on communities in terms of particularly the social development side of issues? Because it's that given communities in the Highlands and other areas a real grasp of what can be achieved if they're actively involved in regeneration.
Massive confidence, I think, would be a significant descriptor that most communities would come readily to. I think that the longevity of the relationship, I probably will mention as many times as I can get in whilst I have the opportunity of being in front of the committee, is so fundamentally important, as is the expertise and guidance of staff who understand communities and who have been there. If I, when looking at programmes, sometimes coming to us cold, hi, can you deliver X, Y, Z? Can we get the community to participate? Can you give us the results of a sort of interim phase within 4 months? Well, no, we can't. And we'll be honest about that, because the process of demonstrable and genuine community-led development is not, you can do the done to quick and dirty in that sort of time frame, but the longevity of the relationship allows communities to build their capacity, to build their confidence, to be able to identify the things that are important to them. There might be some things that are pressing, but there might be other things that are under the skin, that having a little bit of time and some support to be able to identify those brings huge benefit. So I think confidence is a very significant outcome. And I think also, taking a step back, 500,000 acres of land in Scotland are owned by communities. In the last decade, High has supported 320,000 acres of purchase by the community. So the communities are living on land that they own. And in the Outer Hebrides now, 2/3 of the population of the Outer Hebrides live on land that they own and they manage and they develop. In North Harris Trust, they took ownership of their estate 10 years ago. 62,000 acres of North Harris. Population had declined by half in the preceding 5 decades. The population is now returning. The Trust has built and let 8 social housing units. They've taken forward a whole range of development projects. They're looking at turbines. They've got a very competent, very capable team of staff, very ambitious community. They're looking at setting up industrial units for light industry to increase the economic opportunities within the area. And I could go on, because the achievements of that community within 10 years is absolutely phenomenal. It's truly transformational. The consistent something has been investment by the community and an investment by High and a range of partner agencies alongside the investment by the community.
Councillor Prague, you were wanting to come in
Just very briefly, standing outside high, I mean, she would say that, wouldn't she? But
does.
standing out, and she does, and I'm really glad she did, and so comprehensively. But I've been involved in the Highlands and will be for the rest of my life since 1976, and confidence was pretty low at that time. Population flows were still negative, young people particularly. That has changed, and it is the confidence issue. That's what I notice. I walk around and I talk to people, and they're confident. They're still living in fragile areas, many of them. And why does that work? Well, I think it's because of the local knowledge, the local understanding of that body that really grasps it, and people trust that and are therefore willing to work with it.
But the point I was trying to come to, convener, is take 5 decades, and that good practice over those 5 decades has allowed communities to engage fully in the process and feel valued within that process. Councillor Prague, you made reference earlier to a situation in your opening remarks. You made reference to the urban deprivation as well as rural deprivation in the Highlands. You made reference to a development in Inverness, a particular street in Inverness that you would like to see being regenerated. How do you deal with the competing pressures in terms of regeneration and value for money that is achieved between, say, a development in the city of Inverness as compared to, say, something in Wick, Thurso or Durness in relation to expenditure and regeneration and dealing with the problems of deprivation in these areas?
It's challenging. That's a nice, simple answer. But the answer is, of course, they both matter, and they both matter to each other. And that sometimes, for a big authority like ourselves, is quite a tricky balance. So, you know, we have councillors in Caithness who would always argue that we're not doing enough for Wick. Wick's quite a good example at the moment. Wick is an area which is not in the best of health, if I can put it that way. I walked around there quite recently. But it has potential because of offshore wind and so on in the harbour area, and again, HIE and ourselves, we've done some work already. How do you balance that against Inverness? Well, you do both. You find the resources to do both. You don't do one or the other, you have to do both. But it is also a city region, so Inverness has to be looked after, if you like, as part of the region. We can't just suddenly say Inverness is okay, we'll leave that, we're not bothered with that. The rest of the Highlands is linked to it, it's the heart.
That goes back to the issue you mentioned earlier about 1974, 1976. You talked about depopulation of some of the rural areas in the Highlands. And some of that has been turned around and successfully turned around, but not all. How would you see the future direction of Highlands Council in relation to ensuring that, you mentioned Wick because of the particular issues in Wick, how would the council skew its funding and particularly capital expenditure to assist those communities along the northern coast to fully engage economically with some of the opportunities that are currently available to them?
The answer is we're doing a lot already, and again, but sorry, it's going to sound like a love-in, but it is. We do this together. There was a meeting of yesterday of the Caithness and Sutherland Regeneration Partnership, which I couldn't go to, but it's a classic example of where there is a partnership there which involves HIE, which involves Highland Council, which involves local chambers of commerce and everybody else. So a lot of work being done there. That's because of the Dounreay rundown, of course. You know, the plus of that is that we know the phasing and we know how it's going to work. They're very much involved. We work with that. Wick has different issues. It's a bit further away. I've forgotten your question now, but it was about how do we prioritise that?
How do you engage with those communities to ensure that the council, where they can, drive some of the capital investment that could take place by the council to assist those communities?
I mean, I'll give you an example. We're producing new local plans for these areas, and in Wick and Thurso we held charrettes. I don't know if you've come across them. Yes, you know about them. Dreadful word, but a very good process. And it really does involve the local community. So they come in and they have joined with us and with our planning colleagues to draft their own plan, if you like, and that is now being discussed and consulted on. It's also, I wrote down when I was looking at some of this stuff before I came, Serendipity plays a big part, but serendipity needs a hand, and that's where we get involved. So in Wick's case, for example, it probably will be around the offshore and the harbour that will actually help spark off a lot of that. We can do whatever we like. We could try to put money into pedestrianising areas and all the rest of it. But if the business isn't there and if the heart of the community isn't in it, it will do nothing other than tidy up the street a bit. What it needs to do is open up new shops, open up new activity. So if there is business likely to come into Wick, and we can make sure that happens a bit, we can make sure they recently renamed Wick Airport John O'Groat, Wick John O'Groats. Simple marketing exercise. Sorry, it may sound silly, but it's the kind of thing that begins to change the way a place feels about itself. And John O'Groats is now a very lovely place to visit. If any of you have been there in the past, please go again. It's been regenerated, again with partners like Highland Council and High working on it.
Commissioner, I would be tempted to talk about the John O'Groats signpost here at the present time, but I will avoid that debate and discussion. But thank you very much.
Sorry, Chairman, for
I thought you were about to talk about Old Pulteney there, but we won't go there either. Can I ask you, you've talked about some of these very big projects in some areas, and one of the things which we've heard a lot about is difficulties with state aid. How have you overcome these barriers to deal with some of these big projects that you've been talking about?
We thought that might come up,
yeah,
and we've nominated Rachel.
Rachel, please.
I was telling colleagues of a question that came from the floor of the DTAS conference on a week last Monday, and I was surrounded by esteemed colleagues, and a state aid question came, and everybody looked at me then too, so I'm quite happy to take it. I think the issue with state aid is that it is the provisions of the state aid legislation actually give us quite a lot of opportunity to support communities, and that's quite an important starting point for me, because, and of course not just communities, social enterprises and businesses too, but state aid is exactly what it says. It's aid from the state that allows things to happen that perhaps wouldn't otherwise happen. And there are a number of ways in which we can support communities through the what is sometimes considered to be a bit of a minefield or a bit of a bumpy patch of legislation. But the reality is it's there. And the reality is we must navigate a path through. And the path that High has trod over time is one which we've evolved, and we have developed quite a clear position statement, partly as a response to questions from communities and demands and issues arising around state aid. But in doing that, we've worked with the Scottish Government State Aid Unit, and we've worked with a number of colleagues from Big Lottery and others to look at the ways in which we can have a much more transparent and shared position, because one of the biggest frustrations for communities is a project comes to me and I deem it as state aid, and so I treat it in a particular way. The same project might land on the desk of the lottery, or a government department might take a slightly different perspective on the issue of state aid. So regularising that and having that shared state aid conversation so that it's a common message going back to communities, I think will be a very significant step forward as we progress. And the approach that we have evolved within High, so it's consistent with the approach that we've taken over time, is to look at every project individually. So it's a bespoke response, and to look at the opportunities where we can maximise the mechanisms that are there and properly there. Where can we maximise those mechanisms, not just de minimis, but where there are approved schemes in place. And that's one of the things that we bring to the table, I suppose, as an agency dealing in the arena of state aid a lot, which other agencies don't necessarily do. We can bring expertise and knowledge about those schemes that we can share with others to say, well, you know, here's an opportunity for a scheme which then doesn't eat into or erode, which is how communities view it, their de minimis 3-year rolling little window.
I think your knowledge, it would be very good if it could be shared across the country. I have to say that in terms of answering the question, you're the first person that's ever attempted to answer that question, beginning with positives. And I think that that is really, really good, and I do thank you for that. I think we would be probably interested to hear more about the approach that you take, and again, if you could write into the clerks with how you have overcome some of the often perceived barriers. I think that would be very useful for the committee. Stuart Stevenson and then Stuart McMillan, please.
I just want to pick up on what's been said about state aid there. The issue, as I understand it, in relation to regeneration and a wide range of other areas, is when public money is adjudged under state aid rules to distort competition. Now, I'm getting nodding heads, so that's a confirmation that my understanding of, the issue that we all wrestle with is, and I'd be particularly interested in how we can minimise that and what common myths, perhaps, Highlands and Islands Enterprise in particular, meets about their constraints to the state aid rules. Because I think during our inquiry, in essence, in this area and certain other areas, people feel themselves constrained where in reality no such constraint need operate, is the view we're probably leading ourselves to.
Ms McCormick.
You again?
Yes, I think so.
I mentioned the group that we put together with the Big Lottery and Scottish Government State Aid Unit, and what that's culminated in is our internal business improvement and audit team, within which we have a remarkable individual, Mr. Melvin Walmsley, who is the state aid guru, who we defer to, but we have a significant knowledge across the organisation now. But we have a position statement or a paper which has a focus around community enterprise, because this is certainly where some of the issues of the recent past have emerged. But I'm sure that's been through our board, so it would be a matter of public record. I'd be very happy to share that with you. We're in the process of talking with colleagues in other organisations now about how we go about aligning much more closely and making common and shared decisions on the matter of state aid. But one of the biggest issues that I face is the duck and cover response. Yep. And actually it is an opportunity, and I don't say that lightly, and I've learned a lot in the last 18 months myself about state aid and legislation, but I do genuinely feel there's an opportunity to reorientate what's become a bit of a negative issue and position it back. Well, if I can only give you several £100,000 worth of state aid, surely we need to look at that as a good thing, not as a self-limiting thing. What it does is allow us, if you look at it as an opportunity, it allows us to move into different territory. So, okay, that might be the public intervention. How do we invent the new, the different, the innovative approaches that mean that project that we want to do, recognising the state intervention is what it is? How can we invent the routes or the channels through which we secure that funding going forward? And a recent Scottish Land Fund award to a woodland project is a really good example where state aid was an issue. Forestry is a primary activity. The intervention rate as a result under the legislation is limited to 20%. £1.5 million forest acquisition. So what do? We split it up and we look at the standing timber and we look at the land and we look at a commercial partner coming to the table to bring a very significant sum of money to enable the bit of public sector money that's there, achieve the delivery of the whole project. That community can now take forward creation of woodland crofts, employment sites, it can take forward a whole host of things because we've been able to, that community actually has been able to identify a private sector partner to bring to the party. It's created an environment of innovation, and I think that's where there's an opportunity with state aid rather than it be a duck and cover response from me.
Very briefly, Mr. Stevenson.
Just an observation and a request. Given that we're pretty clear there's huge hidden self-constraint on this issue, which of necessity you cannot measure easily, can I encourage HIE to be as public and as possible in the deconstructing of these hidden constraints that many people feel themselves subject to using the evidence base that you have. That would be extremely helpful.
And we would love to see your position paper if that's at all possible.
I'm sure that can be shared.
Thank you. Stuart McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. Actually, Stephen just stole the question I was actually going to pose a moment ago, so my apologies. But actually, I do have another one. It's in terms of one of the points that was raised earlier on was regarding Machrihanish and the community involvement, and was it something like 70% of the population taking part in the whole kind of wider community involvement operation. Over the last,
And just to clarify that point, that was in terms of the vote to go ahead with the land ownership as opposed to community involvement, just for avoidance of doubt.
So over the last decade or so, have there been any marked differences in terms of comparisons between urban and rural areas, where there's actually been more more community involvement to take part in schemes that are taking place?
Councillor Pragg, do you want to go first?
It goes to the heart of where communities work and where they don't, which is, I think, really perhaps at the heart of your question. And I have both in my ward, so I can recognise that quite well. The rural community works in some ways an awful lot better, positively, as somebody said earlier on. They don't all, but it does. One of them, actually, there's one that has more problems. I think they more naturally have something to hold them together. They tend to know each other better. That is much harder to do in most urban areas. And it may work, but it kind of comes back to a point that we made in our evidence, if I can drift off in there a moment, which is about some communities are very good at leading stuff and coming forward with ideas because they have the right kind of people with them. If you'll allow me to use an example around broadband and community broadband, there are areas where there are people with expertise who are able to put together schemes and come forward with funding ideas and how it would be done. There are other remote communities, through no fault of their own, happen not to have the right kind of people. Now, do you leave those to wait and say, well, they're not coming forward with anything? Our view would be, not that we have direct involvement with that, but our view would be that with a community that perhaps doesn't naturally have that leadership or doesn't have that expertise, it's then our role to perhaps support that a bit. Not to come in top down, but not to ignore it just because it's not coming up with the ideas itself. There's a little bit of, it's very fashionable at the moment to say it's got to be the community that comes forward. I totally agree with that. There are some communities that are not awfully good at that, and therefore it's our job, I think, to help that to happen. So it's not directly a question, but it leads to a really interesting issue that we feel quite strongly about, that we have to find the right level of approach for different communities. And sometimes that'll mean us getting more involved than with others.
Mr. McCann?
Yeah, I think that's it's very interesting when you look at that question, how do you engage communities? How do you get a community who hasn't been active and to become active? Is it just how do you create the conditions? What are those conditions? I mean, the thing that we did with the leader programme was, again, certain parts of Highland where there was a very, very active groups, and all we had to do was provide cash. It was a catalyst for more activity to take place. But there are other groups in other areas where, as I say, it's been very much slower, maybe sometimes small towns, much slower to get involved. And what we did in this particular programme was that we said, well, we've got the opportunity with this programme. We decided that we would have, because again, in Highlands geography, we had 11 local area partnerships, we would give them an allocation of funding so that they would have funding themselves, that they knew that if they put together a development plan, if they did that preliminary work, they actually have a bit of a guarantee of funding. And actually that was the catalyst then for groups to come together and to work. And therefore what we found, they were slower, other areas were much faster to pull down the projects and pull down the funding. But these groups knew, and it took time, took 2-3 years, but then the momentum started to go. So you're creating the conditions for that. Indeed, in our expression of interest for the new leader programme, we're saying, wouldn't it be great if the funding allowed us to have an urban one for Inverness? So again, to try to do a similar type of thing, to try and get that encouragement.
Ms. McCormack.
Early stage community interventions, early stage community organisation interventions are really important in creating the capacity for communities to be able to go on and think bigger things. One of the things that our assets team has done for a best part of a decade is to provide access to expertise, but access to a little bit of resource I mentioned earlier that allows the group to be autonomous, to make some decisions. We don't put whistles and bells caveats around that money in terms of how it should be spent. We encourage the community to think about their trajectory, their governance, their constitution, and having gone through some of those early stage development processes, encouraging them to think about how they engage with a wider community. High consulting with community partners and residents, if you like. That's not something that we would today get involved in. I'm not sure whether we've gotten involved in it in the past, but community-led activity, even if it's not a strong constituted community group, communities leading that dialogue locally is so much more meaningful, as shown by the Macroharnish example. That's what I was trying to illustrate there. There's just more responsiveness, there's just more uptake, and we're all in it together. There's a sentiment that things are going to happen if communities collaborate. And I think what the land ownership in the Highlands and Islands region and the asset ownership, over 150 assets have been acquired by communities in the High region with high support over the last decade. What that is very, very visible to other communities that actually we can do this. So there's a rationale, there's a purpose behind getting involved, and it's not we're not on a hiding to nothing. There's confidence that they've done it over there, they've done it over here. We can do it in our community.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for your evidence today. It's been very useful. I'll suspend the meeting for approximately 10 minutes for a comfort break.
Thank you. We now move on to our third panel of witnesses today, third and final panel today. Could I welcome Aubrey Fawcett, Corporate Director of Environment, Regeneration and Resources at Inverclyde Council, Stuart Jimison, Head of Regeneration and Planning at Inverclyde Council, and Alan McQuaid, Business Infrastructure Director at Scottish Enterprise. We're also joined for this panel by Duncan McNeill, MSP. Can I welcome you today? Can I invite you, Duncan, to make any declarations that are relevant to the committee?
I'm not aware of any interest that I would be required to declare at the committee, and would refer to my written statement on declaration.
Thank you. I'll take you in at the end, Duncan, after I've given members the opportunity to question. Members will be aware that we've invited witnesses from all of the urban regeneration companies in Scotland to give oral evidence as part of this inquiry, and we'll be hearing from other URCs at our meeting on the 25th of September. I'd like to start by asking our witnesses if they'd like to make any opening statements.
Not in a minute.
No opening statements, okay. Can I start off the questioning by asking you, gentlemen, what were the original objectives of Riverside Inverclyde, and what progress has been made in achieving these objectives to date? Who's going to start? Mr. Fawcett.
Convener, I'll kick off with that. We did share a paper with the members of the committee. I don't know whether that's been circulated.
Sure.
And I'll refer members to the start of that, which allows us then to go into the detail of what is the objectives for. I can just get the right paper here.
That's the private paper. Yeah, Mr. Wilson.
Sorry for this. I'm just seeking clarification. Could Mr. Fawcett be clear about, is this the paper we received in confidence?
Correct.
Convener, I just need clarification, because if Mr. Fawcett's going to make reference to that paper, my understanding and the committee members are honouring the agreement that was made when the paper was supplied to the committee to keep that paper confidential.
Okay,
if Mr. Fawcett's going to start quoting from it, then has the council then lifted the confidentiality agreement that has been reached with the clerks regarding that paper?
Mr. Fawcett.
No, the council hasn't lifted that at the moment, because the council, Scottish Enterprise and Riverside and Inverclyde are in the process of still considering the paper. So I think, Mr. Wilson, you're correct in terms of quoting individual elements. What I could say without causing any difficulties in that regard, and we do consider that this is still a private paper. We will be in due course releasing most, if not all, of the contents once we've finished our consultation process, both internally and with the stakeholders that were involved in participating in providing information in that regard. So I'm quite happy, but if members can have access to the document, you will certainly see that in terms of the context and their objectives set out in that paper, if I can make it easier, Convener.
Mr. Fawcett, if you could not directly quote from that paper, which you say still remains in confidence, but give us an idea of what the original objectives are for Riverside Inverclyde, and where you are in actually succeeding with those objectives.
Okay, Convener. What I would say is one of the main planks of activities and objectives that they were required to participate in was the physical regeneration of the Inverclyde area. That required them to concentrate their activities around 7 geographies, of which another one was bolted on at a later stage, being Gurrick. And out of that, they were also supposed to be involved in providing activities related to the physical regeneration, in terms of facilitating economic restructuring and obviously engagement on the issue of access for opportunities for the members of the local community. So those are the sort of main planks of activity that their objectives were associated with. And I'll keep in mind in terms of being as general as I can in terms of the paper, Convener.
I think it's fine being as general as you like to be in terms of the paper, Mr. Fawcett, but I don't think that stops you
from actually giving us detail and fleshing out the bones of the original objectives and where you are now at. I mean, for example, we have just heard evidence from Highlands and Islands Enterprise where the representative stated that, you know, they have, for every pound that they have spent in some of the projects they've been involved in, there has been a return of £6.60. Could you give us an indication of the kind of return for each pound, each public pound that has been put into Riverside Inverclyde?
Okay. In terms of what I can cover is some aspects of what RI's published published targets were way back in 2006 and 2007. And that involved a range of providing 77 hectares of land for development purposes, provision of business space, jobs created, and so forth. So they were identified in a public and probably quite accessible on their website. In terms of what has been provided, in relation to the level of funding that has been allocated so far, they provided, in terms of business space, equivalent to, and if I can work on the basis of percentages here, around about 66% of money has been expended so far in terms of public money. They managed to achieve, in terms of business space, round about 66%. If you take on board that one of the facilities they funded was the theatre. Over and above that, the number of jobs that they provided is small in proportion at the moment, in the order of around about 191 jobs. However, I would say that based on...
What was the target for that?
The target on that was 2,600.
Okay.
So in terms of how that lies in terms of the grand scheme of things, as you heard, I think, from one of the first councillors that was in this seat, I think, he identified as regeneration being very much a long-term business. We're quite clear in our submission on the Inverclyde Council submission that regeneration is a long-term business. I personally have been in regeneration, going back many, many years. I headed up economic development at Clackmannshire Council, principal economic advisor at Fife Council, head of regeneration at North Tyneside Council, and now currently economic director up at the Inverclyde. And I'm absolutely clear that in terms of trying to compare what is actually achieved halfway through a development programme, which is purely a snapshot, and looking at what was the original targets is absolutely not the way to say whether you've achieved something or whether you haven't achieved something. And when I guess when you engage with the other urban regeneration companies, you will probably get a similar message. I am aware of one particular urban regeneration company who had something in the Scotsman recently, who identified that they had created something like 360 jobs. So these are not seismic numbers halfway through their development programmes. But I can understand the committee's maybe concern that maybe numbers are not as high as they should be. What I would say on behalf of Riverside Inverclyde in terms of where we are at the moment, and I'm here as representing the council, that Riverside Inverclyde, like every other urban regeneration company, has gone through a period of development which has seen probably the worst economic decline that this country has seen, or indeed globally we have seen, for many, many a decade. So to identify that maybe the shortage of jobs created as opposed to jobs safeguarded, because Riverside Inverclyde have identified a whole range of jobs that they've safeguarded, probably would be an unfair position to get to, convener, I would suggest. But we have identified as part of the mid-term review a snapshot of exactly where performance is at the moment. But the long-term plan was to run at least for 10 years, and the council is committed to that. And I think in terms of the overall judgment, I think one of the same councillor mentioned it was a 20 to 25 year before you start to see heavy, significant impact. And I would say his judgment is about spot on from my perspective.
You've concentrated on jobs here, and you know that wasn't the initial thrust of my question. It is round about leverage. And you know, Highlands and Islands Enterprise have said today here that for every pound that they have invested, there has been that leverage of £6.60. Can you give us an indication, Mr. Fawcett, of what has come in from the investment that has been made from the public purse?
As part of the report, we didn't get into that. We identified what opportunities there would be in terms of the added gross value, which was round about 9% compared to the original target. So that's roughly where it was in terms of the GVA.
Round about 9%,
yes,
compared to the original target, you've said.
Yeah, the original target for, say, private sector, is a private sector investment you're referring to. The original target for private sector investment was of the order of, well, first of all, that was the original target for GVA was 90 million, and the original target for private investment was in the order of £295 million, and that was a published number that was identified about 6 or 7 years ago. And where are you at now? In terms of private sector leverage? Yeah. Private sector leverage at the moment is sitting with around about £3 million, £3.5 million.
Out of an investment from the public purse thus far of?
Out of a, say again?
Investment from the public purse thus far?
I think it's in the order of about £60 million, 61.
Okay, I think we may come back to that. Margaret Mitchell, please.
I mean, part of your evidence today is to give an idea of how the various partners work together. So could I start perhaps, since we've got a representative from Scottish Enterprise here, to ask how Scottish Enterprise works within Inverclyde Council to provide physical, economic and social regeneration in the area?
Obviously in close partnership with Inverclyde Council in terms of the points you raised. Scottish Enterprise is a national agency, so our focus is on the national agenda, with Inverclyde being part of that. Our contribution or our work with Inverclyde is through our focus on account managed companies and on sector growth, and our contribution to the Urban Regeneration Company. You'll see from our submission that previously we were a funder of urban regeneration companies. That has moved now to, we no longer do that. However, we make a contribution to the Urban Regeneration Company through my position, which is also a member of the board, and I have responsibility within Scottish Enterprise for all of our 4 urban regeneration companies. So our contribution is to focus on the economic growth within Scottish Enterprise agenda, which is on key sectors and on company growth in the main. And as part of that, for example, we are in dialogue with the Council around what potential Inverclyde has to play in the offshore renewables industry, and also what potential there is for further development for tourism through the further development of Ocean Terminal, where the cruise liners come into Greenock. So very much sector-led and around specific areas.
And at a more local level?
Well, in 2008, with the change away from the local enterprise companies, Scottish Enterprise, it was agreed, would not be part of local economic development and local regeneration, so that now is very much the focus of the Council. We obviously have dialogue around that, and there's a relationship, particularly around company growth, between account managed companies and the Business Gateway, which is the focus of the responsibility, in fact, of the Council.
Oh, whether it's more general, local, how do you ensure that there's no duplication and that there's absolute value for money in all that's being done and looked at?
I'm through, as was referred to in previous sessions, through dialogue and ensuring that we are absolutely joined at the hip in terms of development projects, and through being assured that where we are working with a company, for example, there's no overlap in terms of other fundings.
I think in the previous session there was an interim review mentioned, account management. I mean, is it just dialogue, or is there something more concrete you can point us to?
Well, it's through the relationship and making sure that if we are working with companies, the Council know what we're doing and where we're supporting them.
So there's no actual mechanism that you could point to, well, we have
Well,
this
there's
interim review,
the mechanism across Scotland for companies that would come through the pipeline from business gateway to account management companies, to account management, that it is in place and is reviewed regularly. I'm the responsible officer for Inverclyde Council, so it's my responsibility to ensure that there is no overlap and that there's dialogue. And as has been mentioned, I think it was Mr McCann sitting in this seat, it comes through close working relationships.
From the Council's perspective, Mr Fawcett?
I would agree entirely with Mr McQuaid in terms of engagement. We do get together on a regular basis. Alan and I have regular meetings. I have to say, being working in Scotland with the old enterprise network and with the new enterprise network, as I would see it, I think it's quite clear where the lines of responsibility are, but also the ability to help each other. And I'm very impressed, I have to say, with the way we engage now with the enterprise network. And I have to say, going back years, councils of the past probably weren't as effective engagers, or indeed maybe Scottish Enterprise wasn't, but we have got an absolutely spot-on relationship in terms of working together, and I think it's working extremely well.
Is there any examples you could offer the committee of, you know, something that you perhaps feel, yeah, we were on top of that, or dialogue identified duplication here, or
maybe give one specific, if I may. The outcome was positive. Was Shed Media, a company interested in property, who produce Waterloo Road, the television programme, if you know that. Yeah. And it was known that they were looking for a school facility. That came across my desk in terms of interest in property of that sort. I had a conversation with the council in terms of what they might have for surplus property. The URC were involved in the discussion as well, and the outcome was that Shed Media chose to come to Greenock. Now, they were given the opportunity across a number of locations in Scotland, and it's the way, as Aubrey said, we work, that we put proposals together. And that's an example of Greenock. I would have suggested would probably have been overlooked if it hadn't been for the working relationship in terms of good dialogue.
It's good you can point to something positive. Sometimes we learn more from negatives. Mr Jameson?
We have regular engagement with the account managers within Scottish Enterprise. We have a positive working relationship with them, and we believe that the businesses within Inverclyde benefit from that.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mrs Mitchell. I'm in a little bit of a quandary, gentlemen, because obviously we have a document that was not for publication. And Mr Fawcett, you started off by trying to quote from that document. And I'm going to try and tease out the questions that I've asked previously, which I still really haven't had an answer about. And that's round about the leverage. And Mr McQuaid, you heard the evidence from Highlands and Islands Enterprise. Can you give us an indication of the leverage that each public pound has brought in?
Mr Fawcett has referred to the numbers. I think, can I maybe, if we could step back a bit and a bit of context here around why we are where we are with the document. The report was commissioned jointly by the members of Riverside Inverclyde, Scottish Enterprise and Inverclyde Council. That report was produced in June, and the decision of the Riverside Inverclyde board, who were considering that through the chair, was that there would be a special board meeting to consider the report and to put comments, as you would expect, from the organisation being reviewed, and the review was independent. That board meeting, due to summer holidays, etc., didn't take place until the 7th of August. And the outcome from that was that further comment would be put back to the consultants, and in terms of factual position and in terms of challenge around their interpretation of the numbers. I think, as a board member, the leverage figure appears low. but we're still in the process of reviewing that to determine what the actual outcome is. But certainly it's lower than anticipated, and way lower than anticipated in terms of the targets that the company set in 2008, which was a completely different position in the economy than we are in at the moment.
Gentlemen, I'm sure you can probably understand the quandary that I'm in, and other committee members are in too, and the fact that we have received this report, we have agreed not for publication, and the first thing that you do in giving evidence is to start to quote that report that's not for publication, which Mr. Wilson rightly picked up on at the initial stages. I'll turn my question around. You've said that leverage is very low. How does that compare to other urban regeneration companies?
To have to look closely at the position with urban regeneration. I would have to come back to you on that in terms of providing written further evidence.
Yeah. When is this document likely to become a public document?
Well, as I said earlier, the Riverside Inverclyde Board is considering it. The Riverside Inverclyde Board are meeting tomorrow to have further discussions on it and on the way forward. I would hope that we could get to a point, and I think with the pressing from this committee, I would encourage the board to get to a point where we can look at releasing the majority of it. There are certain issues within the document that cover off what I would consider to be commercially confidential aspects of relationships with third-party organisations.
And this committee understands those kind of relationships and has always behaved with honour and integrity in that regard. I'll come back. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I think at the outset, I do want to stress kind of one point. Since I was elected to this Parliament, I have been supportive of Riverside Inverclyde, and I've got various comments, whether in here and also outside of here, that I've actually been supportive of Riverside Inverclyde, because I have seen actually the benefits of the infrastructure they have actually put in place, and I commend them for that. But they are a public organisation. They do receive public monies, and like any public organisation, it's important for them to be thoroughly scrutinised. So with that kind of being the background, also there has been much kind of public commentary over the summer regarding various elements of Riverside Inverclyde. And I'm going to tie in a question to actually something that was in the submission from Inverclyde Council. It was an answer to question 1. It was in the third paragraph, the line beginning with the focus of this approach will be on improving the quality, quantity and sustainability of outcomes achieved by placing results ahead of process, drawing on the sound empirical base responding to the evidence priority needs of the community. It struck me that also certainly with some of the allegations over the summer, that if this actually has been the case, that the process hasn't been fully followed through in terms of proper scrutiny at board level, if meetings haven't been taking place on a regular basis, if the papers haven't been as robust as they should have been, and if there hasn't been as much in the way of questioning and thorough questioning as there potentially should have been. If that actually has been the case, where actually has been the evidence priority needs of the community?
Mr. Fawcett.
I think we are moving into some territory of the detail of the report, Convener. In relation to the submission from the Council, Stuart Jamieson will cover some aspects in terms of targets and outputs, as I see was asked for from every other council at this session. We have a focus currently on Riverside and Inverclyde, but in terms of your question around the Council submission, quite happy for maybe Stuart to pick up on that.
Thank you, Chair. An example of where the community have been listened to is in respect of our employability programmes. Inverclyde Council has developed some employability programmes in liaison with the Community Planning Partnership. There is a strategic employability group which is representatives of the public sector, the private sector, the third sector and the voluntary sector. In designing our programmes for a £2 million employability programme, we have engaged effectively with the community. We've listened to the community in respect.
If that £2 million programme is Riverside, Inverclyde money, or whether it's Inverclyde Council money?
Through you, Chair, it's Inverclyde Council money.
Okay.
So we've listened to the community, we've designed our programmes based on what the community require, and on that basis the level of scrutiny that we have within those programmes is extensive. There's monthly monitoring provided to the Council in respect of those programmes. They are tendered programmes, and indeed those programmes are also supplemented by European structural funds, and the level of scrutiny which is provided by European structural funds indicates to us that we are delivering programmes which are effective within Inverclyde.
Mr McMillan.
Thank you. Where has the tie-in been with Riverside Inverclyde and actually the both organisations following through and working in tandem with a strategy?
He's going to pick that up, Mr Fawcett.
Thank you, Convener. It was quite clear when at the outset of Riverside Inverclyde that they would concentrate on the physical regeneration aspect, whilst the council team concentrated on the employability and the, I suppose, the softer elements. And that essentially, I have to say, was a fairly successful strategy, and Stuart's team did not get involved in active physical regeneration. So there was quite a clear cut, wee bit of blurring on the edges, which we recognise around business development support, but that essentially was how it was led.
Okay.
Thank you. Just on also the members' agreement was signed in 2008. Also, RI was set up in 2006. The members' agreement signed in 2008. And in between that point, there was some £8.6 million had been allocated to Riverside Inverclyde for expenditure. And so, how would that money have been thoroughly scrutinised?
Convener, I'm trying to get my drift about in terms of the types of questions which colleagues from the other councils and we as council officials were asking or being asked, and the relationship between those, because they're quite focused on the activities of Riverside Inverclyde. So I'm trying to weigh these up in terms of how we're going to answer some of the questions that to give flavour about regeneration as a whole within Inverclyde, not just specifically Riverside Inverclyde. When it comes to the scrutiny, the scrutiny had gone on. We are the two accountable officers. Our job is to engage with Riverside Inverclyde, and those activities did take place.
Mr Fawcett, committee members are free to ask the questions that they wish to ask. You know, some of the evidence that we've had earlier today, we've questioned you on exactly the same things. Thus far, you have failed to give us the answers to that because of this document, which is not for publication, which we agreed we would not refer to. But the first thing that you did today was to refer to that document. Now, I'm going to try again in terms of the return rate, because Highlands and Islands were very honest about that, and we're not getting very far. Could I ask then if the return rate is better than pound for pound?
It doesn't appear to be.
It doesn't appear to be?
No.
Okay. You talked, Mr McQuaid, round about the downturn, and we're all very aware around this table and throughout the nation and probably throughout the globe about the downturn. Were targets adjusted? Was there a realistic adjustment to possible achievements at that point?
In terms of the business plan, the targets remain set as ambitious. So the answer to your question in a word's no. But part of the mid-term review that we're carrying out just now was to determine the direction of travel for the company and to review how best to revise the targets. And these targets were discussed at the...
Can I stop you there? Because obviously we're at that mid-term, or we've had that mid-term review now. So at the beginning of the economic downturn, 2007, 2008, right, you waited how long before you actually went and started those adjustments?
In terms of the URC is an arm's length company, so the board, with a mix of public and private sector members, with a private sector chair, determined on working with the chief executive that the targets would be held.
But you know, bodies, public and private, right across this country and others, realigned business plans at that particular point in time, realising that there was a lot of different things going on, some things that had never been experienced before. Are you telling me that at that point, Riverside and Inverclyde did not change their business plan?
They changed their business plan to adjust in terms of the direction of travel. They took on, as Mr Fawcett's mentioned, an additional area of focus. They looked more at focus on areas where there would be economic development outcomes, for example, the provision of the direct provision of business infrastructure. River Clyde View office developments, for example, came forward through the business plan to help address the economic downturn. So they adjusted their business plan but left the targets.
So no adjustment to forecasts or targets?
Well, it's as we've said, it's a long-term regeneration strategy which was set out. So in terms of the long-term agenda, you've got to be ambitious. So the board determined that they would leave the agenda, the targets as is, in being ambitious and taking a long-term view of outcomes.
I understand ambition, but there's also realism too. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. It's, in terms of some of what was just been discussed there, and the issue of the targets, were there ever any discussions that took place between Riverside, Inverclyde and Inverclyde Council in terms of the resources that were actually available to them, but also in terms of the actual the vision of what both organisations actually would like to have seen happen in terms of the wider regeneration within Inverclyde? I.e., was it a shared vision, or was it two independent visions? And was there any cooperation?
Mr Fawcett, do you want to go first?
Convener, well, there was dialogue going with the chief executive over quite a long period of time. And we did agree which areas of activity we would get involved in if there was close where there could overlap. So yes, that did happen. In terms of the strategy, the document which RI worked to, first of all, they had a business plan, and they did review that business plan. And just to add to Mr McQuaid's evidence, they reviewed, I think, the last time they had a full comprehensive review was going back in October 2012, where they did make slight modification in terms of their targets, but essentially they kept on to that sort of level of targets that they were working to previously. So in terms of, we have an economic Inverclyde regeneration strategy, which is for the whole of Inverclyde, and their work which Riverside Inverclyde would have complemented that. So we weren't divergent in that sense. But clearly, as an arm's length organisation, they have got and set up, they operate in a way which allows them to have a degree of flexibility, and that's what they adopted. Does that help, Mr McMillan?
Okay. In terms of the situation now with certainly with Riverside Inverclyde and certainly Council, what's the process now in terms of moving RI forward, and also in terms of having a shared a shared operational model or shared vision and better and closer cooperation. What's actually going to happen?
Who's going to deal with that? Mr. Fawcett?
I'm quite happy to deal with that, Commissioner. Again, I don't want to refer to the report, but in generalities, there's a recognition that there is a need to have one single operating plan. And that would be developed in line with our in-house teams as well as Riverside and Inverclyde. Obviously, the board of RI have to finalise their conclusion on what they perceive that comes out of the mid-term review. I don't get an impression that they're hugely divergent from what council officers or indeed members think is the way forward. So I think there's the real opportunity to, I suppose, focus on maybe a narrower set of objectives, have a single operating plan, and the one thing I would absolutely say is the council is committed to Riverside and Inverclyde. At no stage has it moved away from not committing to Riverside and Inverclyde. It is wholly committed to providing its £24 million, which it originally had envisaged. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, Scottish Enterprise couldn't meet their end of the bargain. But in terms of the council is fully committed. Not only that, we have provided additional funding for Riverside and Inverclyde, which will come to in the region of £27 odd million, which will allow them to deliver some of the strategic projects that we think is suitable and appropriate for the Inverclyde community.
Mr. McQuaid.
Mr. McQuaid.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, Scottish Enterprise, in terms of the future development of the Urban Regeneration Company, in view of what I said earlier about our focus in national organisation sector delivery, we are very committed to working with Riverside and Inverclyde, but we would look to the council to take the lead on the development of the direction of travel for the company, but we would clearly have an input to the debate. And just picking up on the point Mr. Fawcett made there earlier, a moment or so ago, about Scottish Enterprise not being able to keep to its commitment, there were changes in funding structures which meant that we, in agreement with government, no longer funded URCs with a tranche of our budget transferring into government for expenditure on URCs, and that's now moving to be part of the Regeneration Fund, which will be available next year.
Sir McMillan, are you finished?
Just in terms of when RI was set up in 2006, also it had a 10-year strategy. Was that strategy over-ambitious?
Sir McQuaid.
A different time in the economy. I think you have to, given the challenges in Inverclyde, it was appropriate to try and bring Inverclyde into the mainstream in terms of its position within Scotland. It's achieved a lot, and you mentioned earlier in terms of the the physical regeneration that's going on, the business space that's there. It was appropriate for its time, and I think Inverclyde still has to be ambitious because it does have its challenges in terms of its economy, and we need to keep pursuing that.
I mean, there could be an argument that Riverside Inverclyde was being asked to actually take on roles and areas of land that actually should have been dealt with beforehand, certainly before 2006, and as a consequence of RI actually delivering, certainly in the early days in particular, then actually kind of more was actually put onto RI's plate
I think
what potentially would have actually anticipated.
We're going into the world of hypotheticals there, so I don't think that that's a particularly fair question. And one, when should these things have been done? I think that's not pertinent.
I've got another question, just in terms of the actual the corporate governance and the management of Riverside Inverclyde, with the board meetings, etc. Were they satisfactory in terms of the frequency, in terms of the papers that were on offer, so the information that was available for the decision makers to actually take the decisions that the
board papers were satisfactory. At times, the board timing slipped a bit due to circumstance, and the Council and Scottish Enterprise, through the two of us, were working with the Chief Executive to ensure that the timing of boards, etc., were properly convened in an appropriate way. The governance in terms of the decision-making process was or is appropriate.
Okay, we'll hear at the moment. Thank you.
Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Really just to ask the panel their views on community planning partnerships in the Inverclyde area. Are they supporting community-led generation in your views?
Mr Jameson.
Through you, Convener. The community planning partnership in Inverclyde does work. It does listen to the community. The example that I cited earlier in terms of employability programmes is an excellent case in point, whereby through listening to the community and promoting programmes which are specific for the community's needs, we've managed to address some of the major challenges that we face in terms of unemployment levels.
Anyone else got any views on?
As a member of the Community Planning Partnership, and whilst not, directly involved, as I said earlier, a national organisation, I have to echo what I see in terms of relationships with the community through the council. Day to day, it's not an involved area that we're involved in.
Okay, thank you.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, gentlemen. The first question I've got to ask is, could you advise the committee what the membership of Riverside Inverclyde Board was, and how many of those are members or representatives of the public sector?
From my quick calculation, apologies, it's not something I have in front of me, the members of Inverclyde Board were 2 from Scottish Enterprise, 3 from the Council, 1 from the community, and 3 business representatives.
So that's a total of 9 members, and the chair of the board was one of the representatives from the private sector?
Yes, from the private sector.
Thank you, Convener. That was useful clarification. Could I further ask, what was the day-to-day operational contact between Scottish Enterprise or Inverclyde Council with the Chief Executive of Riverside Inverclyde?
Mr McQuaid, do you want to go first?
The it was month to month. Aubrey and I met generally on a month-to-month basis with the Chief Executive, although I think it's fair to say that that had slipped over the past year in terms of meetings were not overly regular, and we were working to address that, to ensure that the proper relationship was in place.
Could I ask Mr. Right, on you go, Mr. Fawcett.
In addition to the meetings that Alan and I had with the Chief Executive, we had sort of operational meetings as well, particularly around the issue of on the physical development sites and the town plan or the planning process. And we still have those planning liaison meetings where we would engage about what projects were being considered, look at the issues that were challenging, maybe from getting appropriate consents in place and trying to facilitate. So that was an ongoing thing, and Stuart and I sat down with their project managers to review what their thoughts were, what their ideas were, what their proposals were, to try and make things as easy as possible for them to implement.
Thank you. Could I just clarify, in relation to the monthly meetings and the operational meetings that you've referred to, Mr. Fawcett, how regularly did you, Mr. McClory, report to your line management in relation to issues with Riverside and Inverclyde, and how often did you, Mr. Fawcett, report to the council and the relevant committee? Sorry, Mr. McQuaid.
Mr. McQuaid first.
On a regular basis, I, as I mentioned earlier, have responsibility for all of the urban regeneration companies and with Scottish Enterprise activity. I met, my managing director has changed recently, but I meet on a monthly basis, and and range of things across the country that I'm responsible for would be discussed with URCs picked up on by exception if there were issues to be addressed.
Mr. Fawcett.
Thank you, Convener. Mr. Wilson, I have an obligation to get the operational plan up on a yearly basis. There are regular reports that go up in between that in terms of identifying progress on projects. So there is a regular engagement with members, and in terms of the recent report, engagement with them in that regard as well. So we're not backward at going forward with some information to members.
Mr. McQuaid, given your experience with URCs, is this a unique situation that we find ourselves in with Riverside Inverclyde, or is this common across other URCs?
In terms of, could I maybe ask for what
just
you mean by...
in relation to some of the issues that we've heard today, in terms of the operation of the URC, in terms of the return for public pound, and some of the other issues that have been identified earlier in the exchanges.
I would say that the URCs in the main all work and function well. Riverside Inverclyde has its current issues that we're working our way through, and so the answer I would say is well, Riverside Inverclyde's issues working its way through. They all function well. There's full scrutiny of how public money is spent. Riverside Inverclyde has its challenges that have been thrown up by the report that we'll work our way through.
Right, thank you, Mr. McQuaid. Can I turn to Mr. Jamieson, convener? Mr.
Sure.
Jamieson, in earlier evidence, gave a figure of £2 million being set aside by Inverclyde Council, and I understand it in a term as a job creation fund. Is that correct, Mr. Jamieson?
Through you, convener.
Mr. Jamieson, yeah.
It's an employability pipeline,
And
so it takes people from the hardest to reach areas towards employment.
Is that an annual £2 million set aside, or is that over a period of time?
The Council's current commitment is on an annual basis.
Right. Can I ask, Mr. Jamieson, how many jobs have been created to date over a period, and could you give the period of time those jobs have been created?
Through you, convener, over the past 3 years, there's been a total of 375 jobs created.
Right, so that's about 125 jobs a year have been created through that £2 million. Go back to Mr. Fawcett, convener. Mr. Fawcett, you made a comment about a single operating plan, and as I understood it, that was a single operating plan across Inverclyde, including Riverside Inverclyde's input into job creation and economic development in the area. Why was it felt necessary by the Council to set aside £2 million in terms of this employability fund out with the current strategy of Riverside Inverclyde?
Okay. Mr. Fawcett.
Thank you, convener. What I did say early on was that the activities of Riverside Inverclyde, one of the primary objectives was the physical regeneration. What Mr. Jamieson is referring to is the softer economic side of things, which requires, and that's where the staff from the Council concentrate their activities around employability and in business support, whilst Riverside Inverclyde focused activities primarily on physical regeneration. So there's a clear divide there. That doesn't say they're out of sync, that's just who did the work, and that's why it is. In terms of the operating plan moving forward, the intention would be to have the thing brought together with the two teams working closer, but that wouldn't stop still having an allocation for physical regeneration and still having an allocation for the employability type activities and business support.
Mr. Fawcett, are you telling me that Riverside Inverclyde had no targets for jobs created? Riverside Inverclyde had no targets for jobs created in relation to the funding that was being provided by the public purse?
Not at all, I haven't said that at all. I think I've referred to earlier that they had a target.
Maybe you want to repeat what you said earlier, Mr. Fawcett,
Indeed.
for the benefit of Mr. Wilson.
I think they had a target of around about 2,600 and they've created 181 jobs. I think I referred to that earlier on.
Right. That's all the questions I have at the present time.
Thank you. Any other members before I take Mr. McNeil in? Mr. McMillan.
Thank you. Just that, also, in terms of some of the media commentary, it was suggested that that trust had actually broken down between the two organisations, or individuals between organisations, and if that actually were to have been the case, would that have affected how Riverside and Inverclyde would have been scrutinised?
Mr. Fawcett.
Well, first of all, as I'm sure you've heard other people saying, I wouldn't believe everything that's said in the papers.
No, indeed.
Mr. McMillan, and over and above that, in my view, trust hadn't broken down. We wouldn't be committing ourselves to large-scale projects with Riverside and Inverclyde if trust had broken down. We operationally had a very good working relationship, so I wouldn't believe all that is said in the papers.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McNeil.
Thank you, Convener. I've not had sight of the leaked document or even the summary as appropriate in the parliamentary procedures. So I will be general, but I would hope to ask some questions that are not just parochial, hence my attendance here from my constituency interest, but which are being considered by the committee, which I believe is a very important inquiry. When we set up the URCs, they were targeted particularly on areas that had been significantly left behind as a strategy, and I think we're talking about North Lanarkshire, Clydebank and Greenock, which, you know, so. There was a commitment at that time to a 10-year plan in recognition that previously we were substituting an over-dependence on particular industries, and they disappeared and we were back to where we were again. So there was an absolute commitment to the 10-year plan. We've heard today that there's been a collapse in the property market which took our private sector out of that, and we haven't got those houses on our beautiful waterfront which we anticipated at that time. We have had the commitment from the government and through Scottish Enterprise where they withdrew their commitment and contributed only half of the £33 million that they had committed. Why have we not been brave enough to defend the 10-year plan and recognise that regeneration is a long-term game?
Who's going to
Mr.
answer
McQuaid.
that? And I know that you don't want to go into the spheres of politics here, but who's going to have a bash?
I think first and foremost I would point out that it wasn't a 10-year commitment. There was the Scottish Enterprise approval was for rolling funding, and there was an earmarked figure of monies that were available to the URC. I think in terms of Scottish Enterprise's commitment, we have continued to honour our commitment through changes in funding regimes that have not necessarily been of our making, and I'm not wanting to stray into politics on this, but we have, through our contribution to the works of the URC through, in the last few years, funding, and through my involvement and my team's involvement and the work on specific sector projects, we have honoured the commitment to Riverside and Inverclyde URC, as I would say we have done with all of the other URCs who have found themselves in the same position.
Mr. McNeil.
You wouldn't disagree that the only people who are contributing significant finance into that URC, that Urban Regeneration Company, now are primarily the Inverclyde Council?
The position is that there is funding coming to the URC from government, and they are in a position to bid into the New Generation Fund for money. So there's money potentially available from government, but I think it's to the Council's credit that they've continued to invest in and support the URC.
McNeil.
I think we've established there that the Council, from your earlier remarks, are standing four square through that process. I suppose the next one, the general question is in terms of the mid-term review, which also impacts on the longer term. When should you judge the outcome of an urban regeneration company or a regeneration project?
Well,
and what harm has the recent leaked paper and the mid-term review in public done to the future viability of regeneration in that area?
I've said earlier that I think regeneration is a long-term play in terms of commitment. And so looking at figures that are a snapshot in time need to be taken into context, and we're in the unfortunate position at this point through a leak that they're maybe not being taken in the appropriate context, and we would hope to make sure that that is resolved. I think that, you know, in terms of the energy that's available through Scottish Enterprise, the Council and the partners in Inverclyde, then we should be able to move forward, and there would be little or no effect on the regeneration prospects for Inverclyde.
Okay.
Let's wait a response from the other witness.
Mr. Fawcett, then.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I think it's extremely unfortunate that we ended up with information being traded in the press effectively in terms of this report. It's not the way to do business. It only causes problems. It causes angst. And partly that's one of the reasons why we're before the committee today, I suspect. However,
there, Mr. Fawcett, because you're not before the committee today for that reason. Okay. We had an intention, as I said, right at the start of this session, that we intend to talk to all of the URCs, and we hope to be able to compare what is going on in all of the URCs, which is going to be a little bit difficult, considering that we have been restricted in terms of what we have in front of us. You know, you started off quoting from the document that we were supposed to not to refer to, yet you have just said just now that that document has been leaked. Now, I haven't seen the leaked document. I haven't seen what the papers have been saying in Inverclyde or elsewhere in that regard, apart from a few snippets which have been sent to me via Twitter, which is not the way to conduct business, in my opinion. You know, if I were in your shoes and having had this document being leaked anyway, maybe now is the time for some openness and transparency in terms of that document, which may help dispel some of the myths that have been built up and may restore the confidence of people and add to their well-being, which surely the URC and its setup was all about. Mr. McNeill, I'm sorry for that. Oh, sorry, Mr. Fawcett, I stopped you midstream. I beg your pardon.
Thank you, Convener. I have to say we are entirely transparent. Once we finish the process, and as Mr. McQuaid was said earlier, our intention is to make as much of the report, apart from the commercial confidential elements, available. So, you know, we're not trying to do. What has happened here, though, and sadly, we wouldn't be here today based on the in-depth discussions, because I've got a lot of questions about what's happening and what's said in the press. We wouldn't be here today if that hadn't been leaked. We would have been able to go through due process, and I would have thought maybe by this time we would have been able to had it published to a greater extent. So sadly, I'm in a difficult position, as indeed you are, Convener, but that's where we are today.
Mr. McNeill.
Well, yeah, I'm aware you've had a long session. I've got another couple of small questions, and I'll not test the patience of the committee or the convener.
Very brief and brief responses.
I suppose, picking up on Stuart Stevenson's question earlier, what if there had not been a Riverside Inverclyde and a urban regeneration company?
I don't like dealing with...
What would Inverclyde look like now?
Hypothetical questions are something which I don't really like very much, I have to say. I prefer to deal in fact. That is a question I don't think anybody could really answer, to be honest with you, Mr. McNeill. I picked
up, Convener, not watching across you, but I picked it up from Stuart Stevenson this morning in terms of what if, what would have happened without the regeneration company, or I'll put it another way. how do we evaluate the significant impact on well-being, which was addressed by John Wilson earlier, on the environmental clean-up that has taken place, that the regeneration of our iconic buildings locally, the access to our waterfront that people enjoy, and indeed the more positive aspect that all, I think my colleague Stuart McMillan referred to that earlier, the visible regeneration of that area is significant and impressive, and it has affected the well-being, I believe, of the people there. Would you agree?
Mr. McQuaid.
Maybe I listened to the debate earlier with interest, and it's an interesting dynamic. One person's regeneration is another person's general business in terms of what councils do. My view on regeneration, in terms of what the urban regeneration companies bring, is a focus to address certain challenges, which is long-term but time-bound, and certainly it's clear in Inverclyde that the sense of place wouldn't have improved if it hadn't been for the work of the URC and the additional monies available to it. It's clear that the new buildings that have been provided, Inverclyde may have lost a couple of significant companies who were looking for new premises and had to move out of the area because there wasn't the property for them that was available. So it has accelerated, URCs do accelerate and address specific problems. I'm not placed to comment on a debate around what do schools do or what do other things do in terms of regeneration. I'm looking at it purely from my knowledge of URCs.
Briefly, Mr. Fawcett.
Well, I don't think there's so much hypothesis in this sense. I think there is real tangible evidence that Riverside and Inverclyde have brought forward genuine improvements to Inverclyde. They have brought jobs, and we recognise that they are small in number, as indeed many of the other IRCs is my understanding. They have brought forward physical regeneration. They have brought town centre regeneration in terms of the money that's been provided by the Scottish Government. So genuine benefits have accrued. And I wouldn't have thought for a minute I would like to leave the members of this committee with any other lesson than absolutely Riverside and Inverclyde have brought something positive to the table. We've had the debate about how much and the value for money element of that. I accept that, but in terms of the benefits, if they had not been there, we would not have had some of the things genuinely brought to the table.
Mr. McNeill.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McNeill. Mr. Wilson.
You covered the point I wanted to raise earlier. The difficulty I have is that the allegation that's been made that we're referring to the questioning today based on a leaked document. Can I say that many of the questions that I've raised have been based on the evidence provided by the Council, Scottish Enterprise, and answers to some of the questions that were raised during the session. If there has been a problem with the leaked document in the local community, then that's, I think, something Riverside and Inverclyde both have to deal with, as well as the various partners of that organisation.
And I would reiterate the point that this committee intended to speak to all of the URC companies. There is no exception here at all. One of the things I have to say is the fact that we have received a not-for-publication document. The committee has behaved in an honourable manner and with integrity. I have to say, Mr. Fawcett, that you started the proceedings by going to quote this document. That in itself has opened up a further can of worms. Now, my very strong suggestion from having dealt with such situations myself in a past life is to try and get that document into the public domain as soon as you possibly can, after going through your due process, which I would speed up if I were you, so that some of the things which are going about, which you have got no control over at this moment in time, are either put to bed or resolved and get back to the point of creating the right environment for the regeneration of the area that you represent. The unfortunate thing for us at this moment in time is that it looks unlikely that we will be able to compare your organisation as in Riverside, Inverclyde, with the other urban regeneration companies at this moment in time. And I have to say, you know, that it is likely, I would say, that the committee will ask to speak to you again once this is dealt with.
Will you be calling for similar reports and transparency from the other urban regeneration companies?
We will be
helpful, I'm sure.
We will be asking questions that have been asked today round about the leverage and all of the everything else,
but similar
as we have done.
Reports.
They probably, I don't know if they have these reports, Mr. McNeill, but we will try to gather as much evidence from the other URCs as we possibly can. And I thank you for your time today, gentlemen, and suspend this meeting and we'll move into private session.